What's up, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Clockwolf. Oh! And welcome to my analysis of The Last of Us, a post-apocalyptic third-person action-adventure game developed by Naughty Dog and published by Sony Interactive Entertainment. It was created using the Naughty Dog engine and was released as a PlayStation 3 exclusive in 2013. It later received a remastered version for the PlayStation 4, which is the version of the game that we're going to be taking a look at here today. The following video will be looking at the game in its entirety as well as the DLC, so expect full spoilers ahead. The premise of the game is basically about two characters on a journey across America during the zombie apocalypse in the hopes of discovering the cure for this game's version of the zombie virus to save humanity. A story premise that I wager most people who will end up watching this video will have seen about 1,000 times, with the only real twist being that this time the zombie virus is a parasitic fungal plague called cordyceps, a real-world fungus that affects insects in the rainforest of South Africa. This does add an extra layer of believability to the world because diseases that only affect other animals can mutate and affect humans. It happens all the time in nature. See swine flu, bird flu, and AIDS for examples of that happening. The infected people in this game aren't zombies. When someone gets infected, they don't die. Instead, the fungus grows on the brain and destroys their sanity and sense of identity, hijacking their body and turning them into puppets designed to spread the parasite to new hosts. They're not technically dead, which is why you don't necessarily need to destroy the brain like with other zombies. The infected in this game can die from all of the same injuries that humans can die from. While it's true the story premise isn't all that special, the quality has more to do with how it's presented and how it's told. Naughty Dog are one of the better game developers when it comes to making a game with an interesting and believable story, and not having that story feel like it's getting in the way of the gameplay or vice versa. The facial animations and body language in the cutscenes are extremely convincing. The dialogue is also realistically well written and voice acted. If I didn't know any better, you might be able to convince me that the designs for some of these characters are based on real-life people. On top of that, the game world looks fantastic, the sound design is great, and the soundtrack is fitting, giving off a lonely yet peaceful feeling which fits in with the tone of the game. The Last of Us starts out as a lot of post-apocalyptic games do, by showing us what the world was like before the apocalypse. We get introduced to two characters named Joel and Sarah who are father and daughter. She gives him a watch as a birthday present and then she falls asleep on the couch. Joel picks her up and carries her to her room, but she's later woken up by her uncle calling the house.
Hello?
Sarah. Honey, I need to get your daddy on the phone.
Uncle Tommy, what time is it?
I need to talk to your dad now. There's something...
Uncle Tommy? Hello?
The first bit of gameplay gives us control of Sarah. Getting to play as Sarah was unexpected and is still one of the more memorable moments for me. You walk around the house looking for Joel and interacting with things that hint at the outbreak starting outside. You find him and he shoots one of the infected neighbors that tries to attack him. Tommy shows up and they leave the house without packing any bags. They don't even let Sarah put on some shoes or change out of her pajamas for some reason. The next 5 minutes are just sitting in the back of a car looking at the surroundings and listening to Joel and Tommy talk while they try to drive out of town. But they end up getting into a car crash, and from here the player switches over to Joel. Sarah breaks her leg in the crash and you have to carry her through the streets as chaos unfolds all around you. Eventually, you end up getting separated from Tommy and you have to run down a dirt trail while infected chase after you. You can hear them and the sound design makes it sound like they're right behind you. It's not an ideal situation to be in while being so vulnerable and slowed down. This whole opening sequence is well scripted. We play as Sarah at the start where it hints at the outbreak outside. We sit in the car and we see the devastating effects that the outbreak is having on the surrounding area. And then after the car crash, we play as Joel where we see the outbreak at its absolute worst, with chaos unfolding on the screen at all times. The only problem I have is when the game cuts out and the next cutscene starts, Joel isn't running anymore and seems to be just standing there for some reason, which is a bit jarring. Even though I've seen this transition between cutscene and gameplay before, I look at it now and the first thing I think of is, what the hell are you doing? Keep running, they're right behind you. In the cutscene, it shows them running into a military soldier that shoots the infected that are chasing after them. For a second, it looks like they're saved, but then the soldier tries to shoot them. It seems as though he was ordered to because, once again, dead people can't get infected. Tommy shows up and saves Joel, but unfortunately Sarah gets hit. The scene with Sarah dying hits with a lot of emotional weight and sets the tone for the rest of the game, which is significant seeing as this happens within 15 to 20 minutes of starting. It would have left more of an impact if it wasn't for the fact that Sarah isn't anywhere to be seen on any of the game's art. Because of that, I knew that something was going to happen to her. Also, since Joel was literally one of the characters on the box art, I knew he was one of the main characters and that he wasn't going to die because the game just started. It's a shame that this moment was spoiled a little because of this game's own marketing material. But even outside of that, obviously you can only do so much to make players care about a character that they just met only a few minutes ago. Regardless, seeing a little girl bleed to death in her father's arms depicted so believably is bound to make anyone a little sad.
Please, please don't. Please.
After that, the opening credit sequence starts. There's some audio playing giving some context to what's happening in the world. Apparently, the World Health Organization tries and fails to find a vaccine for the fungal plague. Eventually, there's a nationwide food shortage, the government dissolves, and the military takes full control of the country, turning America into a police state. People are required to evacuate to a guarded quarantine zone as the worldwide death toll rises to over 60% of the human race. Eventually, people start demanding that the military reaffirm democracy, with one of the most outspoken voices being a group called the Fireflies. The military refuses and designates the Fireflies as a terrorist organization. After the opening credit sequence ends, we come back to Joel 20 years later. He's in bed and he wakes up after someone knocks at the door of his apartment. It's a woman named Tess, who's a friend of Joel's and a new character that we've never seen before. After entering, her and Joel immediately start talking business. There's a few reasons for this large time skip, two of which are obvious. One is to establish some character development from Joel since we'll be playing as him for most of the rest of the game. The second obvious reason is to show the player the old pre-apocalypse world juxtaposed to what the world looks like post-apocalypse. The third reason involves the cutscene that plays right after the opening credit sequence ends. After seeing Sarah die and Joel grieve, it's safe to say that players might still be a little sad. The game uses the opening credit sequence to give the players a moment while also providing some light world building. Then it fast forwards to the same character 20 years later. He's much older, in a totally different location, and talking to a character we've never seen before. We have no idea what's happening or where we are. We just know that a lot has happened over the course of the 2-decade time skip. In other games, players usually don't care about the characters or the story all that much for a while. The player needs a chance to sort of bond with the characters and settle into the story before they can start to care about them. But since we saw Joel grieving over his dead daughter a moment ago, we're still concerned about him. The story uses Sarah's death as a plot device to make us bond with Joel by proxy, because it's really easy for almost anyone to sympathize with a father losing his daughter like that. So when the time skip occurs, we're immediately drawn back into the world out of concern for Joel, since at this point we still see him as a grieving father. This is one of the better examples of how The Last of Us paces its story so well, and that pacing never fully loses its steam. The gist of the conversation between Tess and Joel is that a former business associate of theirs named Robert sent two guys to try to kill Tess, so now they have to go and find him. They go outside and we see that Joel somehow made his way all the way from Austin, Texas to a military-guarded quarantine zone in Boston, Massachusetts. The massive time skip combined with the drastic change in setting makes it feel as though the game starts twice. Once back in the prologue and once more here. You walk around the street, listening in and participating in optional conversations. You quickly learn that the military in this place is very authoritarian, threatening to beat up or arrest anyone who says something bad about them. The Fireflies keep trying to convince people to rebel against the military, so in response, the military are trying to hunt them down. There's food shortages to the point that people are eating rats and maybe even wild dogs. And there's apparently a problem with people sneaking in and out of the quarantine zone, resulting in a bunch of infections. Joel and Tess try to cross through a military checkpoint, but then the Fireflies attack. Because of that, all the checkpoints close and they have to go another way. It turns out that Joel and Tess are part of a well-organized smuggling ring, so they decide to use a smuggler's tunnel to go around the checkpoints. But this requires them to go outside the quarantine zone walls. While on the way to the tunnel, someone informs you that the leader of the Fireflies is looking for Robert, the same guy that you're supposed to be looking for. You get into the tunnel and finally get a gun. Then you go outside and start making your way towards another quarantine zone entry point. This is where the game first shows off its art direction. The levels in this game are all linear. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but it's easy to forget that just because of how everything looks. The Last of Us doesn't have the highest graphical fidelity, but it does pack most of its environments to the brim with detail. There's so much of it that at times it's a bit overwhelming. You can easily look around at all the details in a given area and paint a picture in your head of what may have happened there in the past. The first environment we're properly introduced to after the prologue is the street inside the quarantine zone. There's Firefly logos and anti-military graffiti all over the sides of buildings. You don't even need to listen to the optional conversations or the NPC interactions to get the gist of the citizens' overall thoughts on the conditions here. But the most impressive areas are some of the outdoor levels that have a ton of plant life. I imagine it probably took them a long time to make these levels look like this and jam so much detail into every nook and cranny by hand. The art direction is easily one of the most impressive parts of The Last of Us. You do a ladder puzzle. We'll get into that later. You go into the basement of an old building and the air is filled with spores from the cordyceps. After someone who's infected dies, the fungus grows out of their bodies and emits spores. If someone breathes in these spores, they get infected. You won't encounter them that often, and when you do, Joel puts on his mask automatically. So they don't really do anything gameplay-wise. You find some infected in the building and a few other survivors that didn't make it. There's a note from one of the survivors that says they got infected trying to sneak into the quarantine zone. There's collectible notes like this all throughout the game that the game calls artifacts. After leaving the area, you do another puzzle, quote-unquote, and re-enter the quarantine zone. You walk through a little market area, and this next part is unintentionally funny. Joel and Tess walk into a large, open courtyard with boxy, waist-high objects scattered around the area for no discernible reason, and there's a couple of thugs hired by Robert guarding the area. Anyone who's played a modern action shooter before will connect the dots immediately. What Joel says after walking into this area, I swear was meant to be a fourth wall break.
Here we go.
I'm not gonna lie, I actually laughed pretty hard after hearing that. Anyway, after Joel and Tess finish killing these guys, we move on to the next area, which is another tutorial section, or at least it feels like a tutorial section, but the game already introduced the basics of stealth in the area before with the infected, and it's not like it's any different from using stealth on humans. I mentioned before about the pacing of the story having a strong start. I wish I could say the same for the gameplay. It doesn't actually pick up until Joel and Tess leave the quarantine zone again later. Before that, there are 6 enemy encounters. One in the basement of the abandoned building, which is the first proper encounter with the infected. The shootout in the courtyard and the stealth section in the loading bay are by far the worst sections in the whole game because of how overly contrived they feel. The sections in the warehouses, the wharf, and the one with military soldiers later on are all better, but it still feels contrived. In all, it takes roughly an hour before the gameplay in The Last of Us starts to pick up steam. Everything before that feels as though the devs wanted to make the levels as simplistic as possible to take into account potential players that have never played a video game before. I hate it when games do this sort of thing. After fighting or stealthing through 2 more areas, you finally get to Robert, and he doesn't seem to be too happy to see you.
Back, get the fuck back!
We just want to talk, Robert.
We got fucking nothing to talk about!
Put your gun down.
Go fuck yourself!
He's running!
You chase him down, and he eventually runs into a dead end and gets caught. Apparently, Robert is in debt to a lot of people, including Joel and Tess. He owes them both a stockpile of guns, and after politely questioning him, he admits that he sold the guns to the Fireflies. Because apparently he owed them too, and he was more scared of them than he was of Joel and Tess. But Robert knew that Joel and Tess would come for him, which is why he sent guys to try to kill them first. After they're done questioning him and figure out what they need to know, Tess shoots Robert in the head.
They're basically all dead. We can just go in there, finish them off. We get the guns. What do you say? Come on. Yeah, fuck those Fireflies. Let's go get them.
That is a stupid idea.
They didn't need to kill Robert, but they did anyway, even though he did kinda deserve it. At this point, though, we get that Joel and Tess are not very nice people. Not only are they clearly criminals, but they behave like criminals too. After some deliberation between the two, they decide to go and try to find the Fireflies to see if they can get their guns back. But the Fireflies find them first. An injured woman named Marlene shows up, who's apparently the leader of the Fireflies. Marlene tells them that if they want their guns back, they'll need to smuggle something out of the city for her. You follow Marlene to her hideout, where we can see that the military is trying really hard to crack down on the Fireflies throughout the city. Apparently, there are quarantine zones like the one you're in scattered all throughout the country, and the Fireflies keep trying to convince people that live in these quarantine zones to rebel against the military. Sometimes it actually works, and the military has lost whole quarantine zones because of it. So it makes sense that they would try so hard to get rid of them. After going through a few soldiers, they make it to the hideout where we meet our second main character, a 14-year-old girl named Ellie. Marlene wants Joel and Tess to smuggle Ellie out of the quarantine zone and get her to the Massachusetts State House, or as they call it in this game, the Boston Capitol Building. It's here that we learn a bit more about what happened to Tommy, Joel's brother who was with him during the beginning and when Sarah died. He seemed to just disappear from the game after the time skip. Apparently, Joel and Tommy stuck together for a while until they made it to the Boston quarantine zone. Tommy eventually joined the Fireflies to Joel's disapproval. At some point, Joel and Tommy had a falling out of some kind. Tommy ended up leaving Boston, the Fireflies, and Joel behind. At this point, Joel hasn't seen Tommy for a long time. Joel takes Ellie to another nearby safe house with another smuggler's tunnel, and Tess goes with Marlene to the Fireflies' main base to verify that she has the guns. Along the way, Joel and Ellie talk a little. She says Marlene knew her mom. She took care of Ellie after her parents died when she was still a baby. Ellie isn't supposed to tell Joel why they're smuggling her, but Joel doesn't seem to care anyway. He's obviously become a much more cold and detached person over the years. They get to the safe house and Joel decides to kill some time by taking a nap until Tess shows up. Ellie points out that his watch is broken. He's wearing the same watch that Sarah gave him 20 years ago. Fast forward a few hours later and it's nighttime. Ellie talks about how she's never been outside the Boston quarantine zone before and how dark it looks. I was hoping that once we got outside the quarantine zone, the surrounding area would actually be pitch black dark, but it was still lit with a large amount of ambient light. Some of the later areas are much darker, however. Tess shows up and confirms that Marlene is safe and that she has their guns waiting. You take the tunnel and make it outside, but you get caught by two soldiers patrolling the area. They call in for backup and scan Joel, Tess, and Ellie for infection.
This is Ramirez at Sector 12, requesting pickup for 3 stragglers. Understood.
Look the other way. We can make this worth your while.
Shut up. Tired of shit. What's the ETA?
Couple minutes.
Sorry! Oh, fuck. I thought we were just gonna hold him up or something.
Oh, shit. Look.
Jesus Christ. Marlene set us up? Why the hell are we smuggling an infected girl?
I'm not infected.
No? Was this lying?
I can explain.
You better explain fast.
Look at this.
I don't care how you got infected.
It's 3 weeks old.
No, everyone turns within 2 days, so you stop bullshitting.
It's 3 weeks. I swear. Why would she set you up?
Ellie's immunity isn't really something that will catch that many players off guard because we've seen this cliché story premise before. But it does catch Joel and Tess off guard, and they're understandably upset. Remember, we just saw Tess shoot an unarmed man in the head a few minutes ago after Joel tortured him. Notice how the camera has us looking up at Joel and Tess just before Tess shoots Robert in the head. Now look at this frame with Ellie. She's looking right up at them, and Tess's gun is constantly in the shot. At this point, most players will be on the edge of their seats wondering what's going to happen next. However, before they can make a decision on what to do, reinforcements show up and they have to run. This is where the gameplay starts to pick up. The soldiers in this escape sequence not only greatly outnumber you, but they have vastly superior equipment. Trying to fight them is a really bad idea, so it's best to use stealth. After you escape the soldiers, Tess asks Ellie about her immunity to the cordyceps. They're supposed to take her to the Capitol building where another group of Fireflies are waiting for them. According to Ellie, the Fireflies have their own quarantine zone somewhere else in the country with doctors and scientists still trying to find a cure. They think whatever happened to her may be the key to finding a vaccine. Joel isn't buying it, but Tess thinks that she might be telling the truth. In spite of Joel's protests, they decide to press on and finish the job they took. They go into downtown Boston, which has been reduced to a ruin. After the military established the quarantine zone, they started bombing the surrounding area, trying to kill as many infected as possible. They see the Capitol building off in the distance, and to get to it, they need to cut through a crumbling skyscraper, an old metro station, and a nearby museum, all filled with infected. At this point, the gameplay has really started gaining steam. Gameplay-wise, The Last of Us falls into a sort of loop from here on. It has you fighting against both the infected and human enemies, constantly switching between being a stealth game, a third-person action shooter, and a survival horror game. There's also some quieter moments for banter between the characters, usually accompanied with traversing the environment and scavenging the area for resources to use in crafting and upgrading, with the occasional one-off sequence sprinkled in here and there. The game switches between all these different scenarios periodically over the course of its 15-hour runtime. Because of this, I'm not going to talk about each individual one, instead I'll be talking about each of these in broad strokes. Starting with probably the most important one, stealth. Stealth obviously uses the least amount of resources, and since The Last of Us is partly a survival horror game, a big part of the gameplay involves finding and preserving resources wherever possible. The game gives the player a hearing mode that highlights the enemies through walls. When seeing this for the first time, it was extremely jarring because there's no context in the story for Joel to have sonar vision. Even more so to have something so video gamey given this game's otherwise grounded and realistic feeling nature. It's common for stealth games to give the player a few extra tools to make sneaking easier than it would be in the real world, but the fact that the player has a third-person camera seems good enough because it lets the players look around corners without exposing themselves. It's not that big a deal though because using the hearing mode isn't necessary. The game disables it on the higher difficulties, and there's even an option in the options menu to turn it off on the lower difficulties if you want to hide it away from yourself. While in the crumbling skyscraper, the game introduces a new infected enemy type called clickers. Runners are people who have been recently infected and have entered stage 1 of infection, as the game puts it. They act as your basic zombie enemy type. Clickers are people who've been infected for at least a year and are at stage 3 of infection. These are the most iconic enemies in The Last of Us and one of the most interesting. They've been infected for so long that the fungus that grows on their brain has started cracking out of their skull and growing out of their eye sockets, leaving them completely blind. Before encountering one, Tess explains that they're blind and can see like bats.
God damn it. Clicker.
Jeez. What's wrong with its face?
That's what years of infection will do to you.
So what, are they blind?
Sort of. They see using sound.
Like bats?
Like bats. If you hear one clicking, you gotta hide. That's how they spot you.
Which means that the clicking noises that they make must be used for echolocation. In gameplay terms, hiding basically means crouching behind furniture and crouch walking slowly, but this makes no sense. Since the clickers are constantly making a clicking noise, that means that they're constantly sending out pulses of sound to draw a perceived map of their environment. So it shouldn't matter if the player is making noise or not. Also, if the clickers are using echolocation, then it really shouldn't be possible to sneak up behind one, since they should be able to at least somewhat see 360 degrees around themselves. They don't see like bats, they just seem to have a powerful sense of hearing. But this doesn't make any sense either because they're still blind, which means that they should be constantly bumping into walls and furniture, because walls and furniture are stationary objects and stationary objects don't make noise. But this never happens. Clickers are probably the best enemy in the game because of how dangerous and creepy they are, and because dealing with areas filled with them can be really tense. But their in-game description doesn't really match up with their in-game behavior. The reason clickers are more dangerous than the basic infected is because they're stronger. When a runner grabs hold of Joel, the players can mash square to push them away, but they can't do the same for clickers. Players can unlock the ability to use a shiv to stab them before they bite them, saving themselves. But otherwise, they're basically a one-hit kill enemy type. Another stealth move involves sneaking up on an enemy and performing a takedown, which involves either pressing triangle to stab them with a shiv or pressing square to strangle them to death. This counts as a stealth kill even though they make a ton of noise while they're being strangled. The human enemies won't notice their friends being murdered even if they're right next to each other. This can also happen if you strangle an infected enemy next to a clicker. The sound effects themselves sound fine, but this is a bit inconsistent feeling and immersion breaking. And since the enemy can't hear you strangle someone, there's no point in stabbing them with a shiv as opposed to strangling them, since using a shiv causes it to break and crafting a new one costs resources. Since clickers are stronger than other enemies, Joel has no chance of overpowering them through strangulation. You need to use a shiv if you want to stealth kill them. Sneaking through an area filled with clickers is very tense. These are also some of the best sections in the game, but these sections highlight another problem with the game, and by far its biggest one, the AI. Clickers have a powerful sense of hearing. When players break into a light jog, it's enough to cause a group of them to swarm Joel, but your AI companions can run around making all the noise they want.
Hold up. I got a key for that gate. I suggest we move quietly.
This problem isn't limited to the clickers. It happens both with human and infected enemies. While you're trying to hide, the companion AI will be running around out in the open. Sometimes the companion AI and the enemy AI will just bump into one another. This has no consequences for the player because the companion AI doesn't trigger the enemy AI to detect Joel, but it's still extremely destructive to player immersion. This probably happens because the companion AI and the enemy AI don't have anything to do with each other. In other games that have AI companions you need to look out for, the friendly and non-friendly AI secretly collude with each other to keep from getting in each other's way. Also, the AI partners tend to mimic whatever the players are doing. If the player's running or crouching, the companion AI should be doing the same. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a better system than the one that's here. There's no way that Naughty Dog is happy with the AI issues in the finished product, which means they either couldn't get the AI to work properly, or they just ran out of time, or both. In combat, the enemy AI does a bit better, but it still sometimes seemed as though it only worked when it felt like it. The worst experience I had with the enemy AI was in a hotel area during my playthrough on the maximum difficulty. I didn't have a lot of ammo because supplies were scarce, so I obviously tried killing all the enemies using stealth. For some reason, when I snuck up behind guys and grabbed them, the game would treat it as though I got detected, so all the enemies in the area would run towards where I was. This would happen even if it was the last human enemy in the area. I would kill everyone stealthily, sneak up behind the last guy, grab him, which would trigger the alert system, and because of that, at least 3 or 4 more guys will have spawned in. One time in another playthrough, I was going through the hotel after killing everyone, trying to scrounge up supplies, and I swear I saw at least one guy spawn in a hallway right outside the room. Occasional glitchiness aside, when the AI does work, it does work well. With human enemies, Naughty Dog uses something called the balance of power system. In a gunfight, the more the enemies detect that they have the upper hand, the braver they'll act. When getting into a gunfight, the human enemy AI will run for cover. There were times when I was aiming at someone hiding behind cover, waiting for them to inevitably pop out and try shooting at me so I could shoot them first like in every other shooting game. but they never did, not wanting to reveal themselves so I could shoot them, leaving us in a stalemate. There were other times when the shoe was on the other foot. I was hiding behind cover, and an enemy aimed his gun over to where I was hiding, waiting for me to come out. So I just stayed hidden, waiting for them to go back into cover themselves so I could move to a better shooting position, but they never did. Instead, the enemy AI kept their crosshairs on me, waiting for me to reveal myself, again leaving us stuck in a stalemate. The human enemies seem to have a decent sense of self-preservation and will sometimes even attempt to flank Joel, which left me constantly paranoid about someone sneaking up on me. The shooting itself is as realistic and grounded feeling as the rest of the game. Joel's crosshairs sway a bit, which makes it so that the player will sometimes just barely miss the target they're aiming at in a way that feels natural. The gunshots are nice and loud, and the weapons feel very powerful, making it so when you hit the target you're aiming at, it feels good and satisfying. When shooting, it's traditional to aim center mass, but in this game it feels as though you need to make every shot count. So it can be tempting to aim for the head, because one headshot is enough to kill an enemy fully. At least with the starting pistol anyway, it normally takes 2 or 3 shots to the body to kill a target. This is true both for human and infected enemies. This is especially true when fighting against enemies that are wearing body armor and helmets. The body-armored enemies take twice as many hits to kill, but their helmets pop off their heads after one shot, leaving them open to a headshot. You can only hold so much ammo, and you can never know when you're gonna get more. This is another one of those video game things that video games do, but when Joel kills an enemy holding a gun, they don't always drop ammo for the player to use, even though they should have plenty of it. This was probably done to make sure that the player didn't try to shoot their way out of every situation that they found themselves in. If they killed 2 guys with 2 shotgun shells and they dropped 5 shotgun shells between the 2 of them, that would turn shooting your way through a section the optimal choice a lot of the time. There are some areas where the player can just sneak through without killing anybody, but there are other sections where getting into a gun battle is mandatory. The developers clearly don't want players to try and stick to one playstyle throughout the entire game. The Last of Us encourages players to do a little bit of both, leaning into whichever one they enjoy the most. There's a total of 12 weapons, including 5 main weapons, 4 sidearms, and 3 throwables. You'll collect them slowly over the course of the whole game. There's 12 levels, or chapters in total, all of which can be selected from the main menu after beating the game. The first gun you get is the pistol at the start of Chapter 2. Then in Chapter 3 you get a revolver, Molotov cocktails, and a hunting rifle. In Chapter 4 you get a bow, a shotgun, and nail bombs. In Chapter 5, you get smoke bombs. In Chapter 6, you get a little handheld shotgun called the Shorty. In Chapter 7, you get a scoped magnum called the El Diablo. In Chapter 8, you get the flamethrower, and in Chapter 11, you get the assault rifle. Molotov cocktails and the flamethrower are very useful against the infected because the fungus growing on their bodies makes them especially susceptible to fire. The bow is the only silent ranged weapon, which means it can be used for stealth. Also, the arrows can be retrieved if they don't break. Nail bombs can be thrown like grenades or placed on the ground like mines. Smoke bombs block an enemy's line of sight and stuns anyone if it goes off nearby them. With the exception of the assault rifle, you can upgrade every gun in the game at workbenches after collecting enough weapon parts from scavenging. You can upgrade things like range, fire rate, clip capacity, reload speed, damage dealt, and etc. You get a variety of guns and you can only have 2 equipped at a time, 1 main and 1 sidearm. But you can upgrade your holsters early on, so Joel can have 4 guns equipped, 2 mains and 2 sidearms, making this the most useful upgrade that you're going to want to unlock right away. After that, the most useful upgrades are for the hunting rifle and the El Diablo. You can upgrade them so that they fire armor-piercing rounds. They both also only fire 1 shot before needing to be reloaded, but you can upgrade that to 3. Even though the El Diablo is a revolver and the gun model has a 6-shot cylinder, it can only fire a maximum of 3 shots after being upgraded. That's probably because the El Diablo was designed to act as a sidearm version of the hunting rifle, like how the Shorty acts as a sidearm version of the shotgun. The ammo carry limit for each gun is small, and all of the guns have different ammo, likely to encourage players to experiment with their full arsenal. Other than guns, there's also melee combat, which just amounts to hammering square. The animations and sound design in combat are enjoyable to watch and listen to, however, especially when Joel uses parts of the environment to finish off enemies. Other than hand-to-hand, you can also find a variety of melee weapons that break after limited use, such as wooden planks, pipes, baseball bats, hatchets, and machetes. They can be upgraded using crafting materials, so they'll kill any enemy in one hit, but they'll still break after limited use. You can also use bricks and bottles in combat, both as melee weapons and to stun enemies by throwing them, but their main use is to act as throwable distraction items during stealth sections, which is why you'll find them lying around everywhere. And to be honest, using them kinda gets a little repetitive over time. Another thing that The Last of Us does well is how it has players use the backpack. A lot of shooters put a limit on how many guns the character can carry at once, usually limiting it to 2. This would make the most sense to do here, keeping in line with the realism, and it's not like it makes any sense for Joel to be able to pull out several guns from seemingly nowhere like in Doom. The Last of Us has a happy medium between these two systems. Joel can equip every weapon in the game, but he can only have so many equipped at once. If the player wants to equip a different gun, they have to swap out one they already have equipped for something else by using the backpack. This adds an extra layer of tension because if a player wants to switch to another gun, it forces them to stop what they're doing and leave Joel vulnerable for a few seconds, since opening the backpack doesn't pause the game. It feels realistic as well, again fitting in with the theme. Another thing the backpack is used for is to access the crafting menu and the skill upgrades menu. To craft things such as smoke bombs, nail bombs, Molotov cocktails, health kits, shivs, and an upgrade to your melee weapon, you need to scavenge for crafting ingredients. You can only hold 3 of each crafted item and 3 of each ingredient, but everything that you can craft stops you from crafting something else. Like, for example, Molotov cocktails and health kits require the same crafting ingredients: clean rags and alcohol. This is the most interesting choice since Molotovs and health kits have 2 completely different purposes, but the other choices are still nice to have, because there really wouldn't be that much of a point in having a crafting system if players weren't forced to make choices with it. The recipes and outcomes for the different crafting choices aren't overly complicated, and the menu is clean and easy to navigate. You can upgrade Joel's craftable equipment by finding training manuals, which are in-game collectibles. These manuals will either improve the durability of shivs, improve the effectiveness of health kits, improve the durability of modified melee weapons, or expand the damage radius of your throwable bombs. Other than training manuals, the game also has you collect artifacts, comic books, and Firefly pendants. The training manuals have tangible gameplay benefits for finding them. The notes and artifacts can have useful information in them, as well as acting as a piece of subtle world building. But finding the comic books and Firefly pendants doesn't seem to serve any other purpose than unlocking concept art and wasting the player's time. There's a few unlockables that you can get, like concept art, by getting in-game achievements and playing the game enough times. You can even unlock different costumes for the characters. You can't dress them up in anything too crazy, and they'll go back to wearing their original outfits in the cutscenes because they're pre-rendered. The craziest outfit you can unlock is for Ellie, giving her a Bruce Lee jumpsuit, a Jak and Daxter backpack, and Jack's goggles. It's funny, but it's nothing compared to the Donut Drake skin from the Uncharted games. The skill upgrades menu allows you to upgrade Joel's skills instead of his equipment. These upgrades are increasing Joel's maximum health, crafting speed, healing speed, weapon sway, and radius of the listening mode. The most important upgrade is probably Shiv Master because it lets you save Joel with a shiv if he's grabbed by a clicker. These upgrades are bought using supplements, which are plants and pill bottles the player will need to scavenge for. The difficulty doesn't affect how many supplements and weapon parts there are in the game like it does ammo and crafting materials. There's the same amount of resources for upgrading in the same places for each and every playthrough. That being said, there's not enough weapon parts to fully upgrade every gun, and there's not enough supplements to upgrade all of Joel's skills. If the player wants to upgrade everything to max, they'll have to replay the game. Anything the player upgrades will be carried over into New Game Plus. This works to add another layer of depth to the decision-making when choosing what to upgrade, since you can't fully upgrade everything before the credits roll. And again, while navigating these menus in the backpack, everything is still moving in real time. The player is given more guns and upgrades over the course of the game, but the gameplay itself never evolves. While Joel gets stronger, the enemies don't, which makes it so that the game gets easier as it goes on rather than harder. The Last of Us should have had a more traditional difficulty curve where the game gets more challenging as it goes on rather than less. The enemy encounters themselves are pretty open-ended, in spite of the game's overall linearity. The players have multiple ways to approach each situation. The stages with infected are usually tighter, but this is especially the case during the stages with clickers, forcing the player to get into close proximity with them, whereas the stages with human enemies are usually more open arena-style areas with plenty of cover to hide behind for both sneaking and shootouts. Next, I want to list off a few smaller things that The Last of Us does that I think are worth bringing up. There's a glitch in the game that should have probably been patched out, but for some reason it never was. If you have one full slot for binding and blades, you can craft an upgraded melee weapon. If you do that and still have another full slot for binding and blades, and have no shivs in your inventory, you can pick up another melee weapon that isn't upgraded and swap back for the upgraded one. If you do this and then immediately go into your inventory after picking your upgraded melee weapon back up, you'll get some free binding and blades in your inventory that you can use to craft a shiv. You can repeat this process until you have full shivs and don't have anything left to craft with binding and blades. This is something that really should have been ironed out with a patch, but for some reason it never was. Although if there was a patch to fix serious bugs, I would have advised the team making it to try to fix the AI first. In addition to stabbing and strangling, if you grab human enemies, you can take them hostage and use them as a human shield. This isn't very useful, however, because of how the combat and how the AI works. When you take someone hostage, you move very slowly, and when you shoot someone, the other enemies will ignore the fact that you have a hostage and start shooting back. You can only use your sidearms while doing this too. Because of all that, you're probably better off just shooting at them from behind cover like normal. Plus, there's only two ways you can grab an enemy. Either sneak up behind them, which means you would need to intentionally fail at the stealth sequence to take them hostage. And again, if you want to ambush a group of enemies, you're probably better off just shooting at them from behind cover. The second one is if you stun or hit them in combat, get close to them, and hope the grab prompt appears above their heads. The problem with this approach is that most of the human enemies have guns, and charging at someone with a gun so you can punch them is obviously a really bad idea. Especially since the other enemies likely won't just stand there and let you beat the crap out of their friend. Taking hostages is neat to do, but it's mostly pointless because of the way that it's implemented. There's multiple animations for the melee combat, and some of them are rare. So rare, in fact, that most people who play The Last of Us will never see them. For example, if Joel is using a melee weapon to fight a guy who also has a melee weapon, there's a rare animation that can play where he'll dodge and parry Joel's attack. Another example, when you attack an enemy on a staircase, sometimes Joel will perform a finisher where he'll throw them down the stairs. Similarly, if you're fighting an enemy and their back is to a ledge, Joel will knock them over it using a push kick. But by far the best one is if you stand on a piece of cover and an enemy with a melee weapon runs up to you, he will pull Joel's legs right from underneath him. The circumstances for this animation to play out are so situational that I would bet that most people who play The Last of Us will never see it, no matter how many times they replay the game. They could have had the enemy awkwardly hit Joel in the shins until he was dead, or had them climb up on top of the piece of cover to get to Joel, but instead the developers had the foresight to make an animation for this circumstance. Because from a gameplay perspective, the only time it would ever make sense for players to actually be in a position as to where this animation would play out is if the player was actively trying to exploit or break the AI. This is another good example of the AI being extraordinarily inconsistent, acting extremely smart sometimes and extremely stupid in others. Just as well, it's an example of the meticulous attention to detail in The Last of Us. Speaking of which, when the player just stands around an area with Ellie, her idle animations will play out. Not only that, Ellie will actually comment that it's weird how Joel is just standing around doing nothing.
Do you want to go somewhere, or you just want to kind of stand here and do nothing? Oh, cool. You're just gonna stand there? So, what are we doing? Oh, nice. You're just gonna hang out. Do absolutely nothing. Just gonna, stand there? What are we doing? This is taking entirely too long. You doing nothing and walking around doing nothing. You are literally walking around in the same exact spot.
The flashlight will never run out of battery life, but sometimes the light will flicker and get dull. When this happens, the player needs to tap on the end of the DualShock controller, in a way similar to how one would tap a flashlight on their palm in real life if it was flickering. If Joel is surrounded by too many infected, he'll crouch down and cover his head, and a prompt will appear telling the player to run so they're no longer surrounded. When one of the characters gets injured in a way that causes them to bleed, the blood will smear on the character models dynamically. When looting, you can hold down triangle and Joel will pick up everything in arm's reach, as opposed to tapping triangle, in which case Joel will grab things one item at a time. The Last of Us has its fair share of Easter eggs too, referencing books and movies that inspired the writing team, as well as references to plenty of Naughty Dog's other games, such as Uncharted and Jak and Daxter, as well as references to PlayStation and Naughty Dog itself. I'm just gonna list off a few of my favorites. In the Prologue chapter, when you're playing as Sarah, there's a painting above Joel's bed that foreshadows a future chapter where we get to play as Ellie. There's a pub in Chapter 5 that's the same pub from the start of Uncharted 3: Drake's Deception. In the DLC, there's a bunch of posters on the wall for the Twitter accounts of various fictional businesses. The Twitter accounts are for Weston's Pharmacy, Spring Hospital, and Petville Pet Stores. These are all real Twitter accounts that you can go look at right now. In the Prologue, there's a PlayStation 3 in Joel's house underneath the TV in the living room. There's also some in an old appliance store in Chapter 9. But if you play the game's DLC, you go into an electronics store and you can see a gaming demo booth for the PlayStation 4. In the Last of Us universe, the official day of the outbreak was September 26, 2013. And the official release date of the PlayStation 4 was November 15th of that same year. I guess this means that PlayStation and perhaps Sony Computer Entertainment are real companies in the Last of Us universe in canon. But unfortunately, the apocalypse happened about a month before the 8th generation of consoles hit store shelves, which is why the PS3 is already in circulation and why the PS4 is still being demoed in stores. Okay, so this next one I just thought was funny. You can find a newspaper lying around amongst the trash and rubbish in the world, and at the very top above the headline it says that there's an Uncharted movie being made, with Justin Bieber slated to play Nathan Drake. But seriously though, no, don't do that. With the exception of the sequence earlier where Joel, Tess, and Ellie had to escape from the soldiers, and one later in the Capitol building, the majority of Chapter 3 and all of Chapter 4 focus on dealing with the infected. While in the museum, Joel gets separated from the others for a short while, but after navigating a few rooms full of clickers, rejoins them just in time to help them fight off some infected. After leaving the museum from the rooftop, the next cutscene plays. Fast forward a little to when they make it to the Capitol building. By the time they get there, all the Fireflies are already dead. Tess is noticeably upset and is determined to get Ellie to them no matter what the cost. She admits to believing that her and Joel are bad people, and sees helping find the cure for the cordyceps as some kind of redemption. Joel is adamant that they should just go home. That's when Tess admits that she's infected. She got bit after you got separated in the museum. The military shows up and Tess offers to stay behind to give Joel and Ellie some time to escape. For her dying wish, she insists that you take Ellie to Tommy's place, since he lives out west, which is where the Firefly's lab is supposed to be. And he used to be a Firefly, so he may know where the lab is. Joel and Ellie reluctantly leave, and after entering the halls, hear gunshots and screaming from the atrium.
We'll go upstairs. We'll probably get out from there. Just keep pushing forward.
Once they make it to the atrium balcony, they see that the military's made it inside and Tess is dead. From here, you need to either fight or avoid the military as you move through the Capitol building. You go down into a nearby subway tunnel to escape, but the military sees you go down there and chases after you. When going down, Joel notices that there's spores in the air. He puts on his gas mask, but Ellie doesn't seem to need one. This confirms that she wasn't lying when she said that she was immune. After escaping the military and finding their way out of the subway, Ellie tries to talk about Tess, but Joel doesn't want to hear it. He doesn't want to talk about their life stories and wants to keep their relationship from getting personal on this journey. They walk out of Boston and go to a nearby small town. Joel says that a guy he trades with named Bill lives there. Bill owes Joel some favors, and maybe he can get them a car to make the journey a little bit easier and shorter. Ellie suggests just taking her back to Marlene, but Joel says that he doesn't think that he could get either one of them back into the city in one piece. This is my first problem with the story. I personally don't buy this explanation. Surely, Tess and Joel must have had a plan for getting back into the quarantine zone after dropping off Ellie. Joel brought that up right before Tess reveals that she was bitten. You could argue that Joel can't go back the way he came and protect himself and Ellie at the same time now that his backup is gone, but even if we granted the writers that explanation, which is a stretch in itself, it still doesn't make any sense. Even if going back is dangerous, it has to be safer, easier, and obviously quicker than going across the entire country to find Tommy, who we later learn lives all the way out in the state of Wyoming. You could say that Joel is just making up excuses to uphold Tess's dying wish, but that explanation doesn't work either because that would mean that Tess's last wish wasn't just for Joel to get Ellie to the Fireflies. It was specifically for him to do that in the most complicated way she could think of. Another argument that could be made to defend this decision is that Tess didn't just want Joel to take Ellie to the Fireflies, she specifically wanted him to take her to the laboratory, which Ellie says is somewhere out west. But this explanation has its own problems. For anyone who's outside the country, here's a map of America. Joel, Ellie, and Tess are in Boston, which is here. Tommy lives in the state of Wyoming, and we later go to Colorado and Utah to try and find the lab. Ellie says that the Fireflies lab is somewhere out west, but Boston is in Massachusetts, and it sits on the northeastern seaboard of America, which means literally everywhere in America is out west of Boston. Imagine them getting to Tommy's place in Wyoming, only to find out that the Firefly laboratory is somewhere back east, like Chicago, and they just missed it on the way, forcing them to make the trip all the way back. The fact that they later learn that the laboratory is actually just a state over from where Tommy lives seems to just be blind luck. If Joel was truly hellbent on getting Ellie to the Firefly laboratory, then the wisest course of action would be to go back to the quarantine zone and ask the Fireflies there where the lab is. Joel could even offer to do it for no payment at all if he was serious about it. If the goal is to get Ellie to the Fireflies laboratory so they can extract a cure from her, then going back to the Boston quarantine zone is the obvious best course of action no matter how you spin it. On the surface, this seems like a small complaint, but this unfortunately means that the story's biggest plot hole is the whole reason for their journey in the first place. The saddest part is, it wouldn't have taken much effort on the part of the writers to fix this problem. We later learn that Marlene and the other Fireflies eventually left Boston and went to the Firefly lab. They actually get there before Joel and Ellie do. There really isn't that much of an explanation as to why Marlene didn't just take Ellie with her when she left the quarantine zone, but it's heavily implied that she thought it would be too dangerous for Ellie to cross the country with her and her men because they were such big targets. She didn't know that the Fireflies at the Capitol building were already dead when she hired Tess and Joel for the job. So she could have been told by Marlene that she and the other Fireflies are leaving the quarantine zone because of the military, without telling Tess or anyone else where they were going out of fear of the military following them. The guns that Marlene was holding to pay them could have been watched over by some guys that aren't connected to the Fireflies but owe Marlene some favors. The plan would go something like this. Joel takes Ellie to the tunnel hideout to wait for Tess. Marlene and Tess go to the Firefly's main base so Tess can verify that she has the guns. Marlene informs Tess that things are getting too hot with the military hunting them and that they need to leave right away. So she has some guys that she trusts watch the guns. Marlene radios into the Firefly team at the Capitol building, who at this point are still alive, and tells them to wait for the two smugglers delivering the girl. The Firefly team radio into the people watching the guns and say to give them to Joel and Tess when they make it back to the quarantine zone. Sometime between when the player is navigating the inside of an old skyscraper and when Joel and Ellie are staring at the sunrise, Marlene's people leave the quarantine zone and the Firefly team at the Capitol building gets killed. We never learn how they all die, but the point is they're gone. So there's no way for Joel to get his payment if he goes back to the quarantine zone since no one's alive to confirm the girl's delivery. And since Marlene and her people are gone, they have no way of knowing where the Fireflies are. So they have no choice but to go west to try and find them. This is an easy solution that wouldn't have affected the rest of the story or anyone else's character arcs. They wouldn't have even needed to redo any of the cutscenes. It could have just been mentioned in one of this game's optional dialogue bubbles. I find this explanation to be easier to swallow than going on a year-long trek across America in the middle of the post-apocalypse in the hopes of finding the Firefly's main base is a better idea than just spending a few hours going back the way they came. Anyway, after walking out of the city, down a road and through the woods, they make it to Bill's town. They do another puzzle to get over a fence and into town. I keep putting the word puzzle into quotes because I don't know what else to call them. They are clearly set up to be treated as puzzles, but they don't challenge the player's critical thinking skills whatsoever. These puzzle sections usually include things such as getting to a ledge by booting up a character, which just involves looking up and pressing triangle, moving a dumpster to climb a ledge, getting a ladder to climb a ledge, using a wooden plank to cross a narrow gap, and using a wooden pallet to get Ellie across bodies of water because she can't swim. The only time any of these were ever challenging to me was the last one the game makes you do, and figuring out the solution to that one took me a total of 10 seconds. These puzzles are not challenging at all, which makes them feel insulting, and only serve to slow the game down, which also makes them feel tedious. Interestingly enough, the quieter moments I enjoyed the most were the ones where the player is left to their own devices. I know it's a video game and the developers probably wanted players to interact with the world, but the areas where the player is just walking around, taking in the sights, and listening to character dialogue are more enjoyable than being subjected to another tedious and repetitive platforming puzzle. After entering Bill's town and dealing with 2 clickers, there's a nice moment where the player's walking around a street, just taking in the scenery while looking for stuff to scavenge. There's a little garden area with some gnomes, an old bar, a music shop, and a nice moment where Joel explains to Ellie what things were like when the outbreak started getting really bad. There's also an old safe with supplies in it if you can find the combination, and 2 doors that can be unlocked using a shiv. You'll find doors like these scattered all throughout the game. If you get through them by using up a shiv, the rooms they bar off are filled with supplies. Joel sees smoke off in the distance and admits that he's never been here before, but he knows that this is where Bill lives. He also says that Bill is an extremely paranoid and unstable person, and apparently has a hard time dealing with new people. Walking through town, you find notes that Bill seemed to have left for himself. There's also warning signs, barricades, and booby traps everywhere. One area in Bill's town that I like is an abandoned house where Joel finds a kid's diary. The diary details what the general mood was like as the infection was getting really bad. At first, the boy is just happy that he doesn't have to do homework. But as you read on, it becomes obvious that the dread and fear from the adults got to him, even though he has no idea what's going on. It ends with him being forced to let his dog go out into the woods and evacuate the town with his parents to a quarantine zone. Another standout area is where there's an infected banging on an apartment door, and you can go in to look for supplies.
You hear that?
Yeah.
You're gonna go in there?
I want to see what we can find.
You're gonna find my body when I die from a heart attack.
Don't worry. I got this.
You go inside and deal with the infected enemy.
Fuck.
Jeez. That thing scared the shit out of me.
Well, while we're here, let's search the place.
While searching for supplies, you find a note left by the previous occupant for his girlfriend to find, telling her that the military is forcing him to evacuate to a quarantine zone and he can't wait any longer, asking her to just meet him there.
You think they ever found each other?
How the hell would I know?
Well, I'd like to think they did.
You go through the town avoiding infected and traps, but eventually your luck runs out.
Come on.
I got you.
Damn it, Bill.
What just happened?
Another one of Bill's stupid traps.
This is one of those one-off gameplay sequences. The player can only use one gun in this sequence, and Joel has infinite ammo for it. For the first half of this sequence, Joel is in danger, and Ellie is too high up for the infected to get to her. But after the fridge falls off the table, Joel gets hoisted too high for the infected to reach him. Then you have to protect Ellie from getting attacked by infected. This sequence is short, sweet, and mixes up the mechanics of shooting just enough to make it feel different. After being stuck up there holding off infected for a few minutes, eventually Ellie cuts Joel down. He gets attacked, but Bill shows up and rescues him.
Get off Drop your ass on your feet.
You run through town with him trying to escape the infected, and eventually you get away.
Man, that was close. Thanks for the heroics and all. Ellie. Hey, what are you... Joel?
Bill!
What are you doing?
Bill!
Let me go.
Turn around and get on your knees.
Just calm down a second.
Turn around
All right.
and get on your knees. Don't test me.
Just take it easy.
Any bites? Oh. Anything sprouting?
Oh, God damn it, I'm clean!
If I see so much as a twitch. Ow!
Stop!
Son of a bitch!
Joel did say Bill was paranoid, and it's a good thing that he checked Joel for bites first and not Ellie because of the bite on her arm. After some convincing, Bill agrees to help Joel and Ellie get a car. He doesn't have a working car, but he does have car parts that he can use to fix one up. Bill keeps asking Joel where Tess is, and at first he dodges the question. But after not seeming to want to let it go, he just lies to him and tells him she's busy. They go to a church nearby to get some equipment. Bill keeps telling Joel that looking after Ellie is a bad idea and he should just ditch her. He explains that he used to have a partner, kind of like how Joel and Tess were partners. But they split because Bill believed that he was better off being alone. Bill gives Joel a shotgun and some nail bombs. Then he explains what they're doing. Apparently a while ago, a military truck came through town, got overrun with infected, and crashed into the side of the high school. They need to go there to get the battery out of the truck so Bill the Builder can fix them up a car. Apparently he doesn't go to that part of town because of how dangerous it is, since it's filled with infected. You cut through a cemetery behind the church as well as some backyards and houses before getting to the front of the high school. Earlier I said that Naughty Dog were good at making games with stories that don't get in the way of the gameplay, but good doesn't mean perfect. It turns out it's impossible to sneak into the front of the school using stealth. Once you reach a certain point in this area, the game makes it so that you're automatically detected by the infected. Even if you kill all the infected in the area using stealth and the bow, the game just spawns in more after the automatic detection is triggered. The reason the game does this seems to be because the cinematic cutscene that plays after you get into the school shows the infected trying to break in and attack you. So the game needs you to fail, so the infected will swarm the area, so the cutscene will make sense. This is something that can happen when designing a game that puts the story first. Think of it as the game development equivalent of surgical scars. When it was time to start designing the level in front of the high school, the developers may have realized that either they or the technology that they had access to weren't quite up to the task to create what they envisioned. But by that time it was too late. Joel, Ellie, and Bill going to the high school to retrieve a battery was already written into the script as part of the story, so they couldn't just remove it. By the time the level design team got to work, the pre-rendered cutscene was probably already finished, leaving them with the task of making sure that the transition between the gameplay and the cutscene makes sense, while also designing the levels in a way that keeps in continuity with the story. I'm sure that the level design team did the best they could with what time and resources they had access to, but there are occasions where the transition between cutscene and gameplay is a bit bumpy. These bumps usually consist of contrived-feeling level design, and worst of all, the game trying to force the player in a certain direction by being straight-up unfair. We'll see more examples of what I'm talking about as we go on. You deal with the infected and climb over a bus to get to the high school. The doors are locked, and the infected are starting to swarm the area, so they have to climb into the school through a window around the back. They get into the school, and Bill opens the hood of the truck, but the battery is gone.
It's empty.
What? Fucking empty!
Guys!
Bill, where to? Bill, where?
Anywhere but here.
You ready to haul ass? Come on.
You fight your way through the school and make it to the gymnasium where you encounter this.
What the fuck is that? What?
Ellie, take cover.
Bloaters are people at stage 4 of infection and are somewhat like this game's version of mini boss battles. They throw sacks of mycotoxin that explode on impact. Mycotoxin is a toxic metabolite that is produced by fungus, so players will take damage if they stay in the cloud. Bloaters also have a one-hit kill attack. If one gets in grabbing distance, it will kill you right away, and unlike clickers, there's no way to stop it. And the death animation when it kills you is brutal. I wager that some players would be disappointed in the bloater enemies because they aren't very mechanically deep. The key to fighting them is more or less the same for all the other infected. Just avoid letting them get close to you while also avoiding their mycotoxin clouds. They're bullet sponges because the fungus growing all over their bodies acts as armor, and a fight with them is usually accompanied with other enemies. But in a game about resource management, bullet sponge enemies are a force to be reckoned with. Plus, for the sake of this game's goal of keeping everything relatively grounded feeling, confrontations with bloaters shouldn't feel like boss battles. Instead, they should feel like another type of infected. There is a little detail I noticed about them, however. See, someone who's infected is still alive, but their ability to understand reason or have a sense of identity is gone. So while they're not exactly dead, it's not exactly fair to call them human beings anymore. The Stage 1 infected are runners, and they just yell and make babbling noises. When they eventually turn into clickers, they start making a high-pitched clicking noise. By the time that they've progressed to becoming bloaters, that clicking noise has turned into a low-pitched growl and croaking sound. Did you hear that? Listen again closely. After beating the bloater, they escape the school and duck into a nearby house. Bill and Joel argue for a bit over what happened, and then they notice a guy hanging from the ceiling. It turns out the guy is Bill's old partner, Frank. Bill points out that Frank's body is covered in bites, which means that he got bitten and then killed himself before he could turn.
Reckon he didn't want to turn, so he...
Yeah, I guess not. Well, fuck him.
Look what I found. It's got some juice in it.
That's my battery.
It turns out Frank was the one who took the battery from the truck in the school. He was attempting to fix up his own car, but he ended up getting bit in the process. The battery's drained, but the cells are still alive. So Bill suggests pushing the truck and trying to use the alternator to jumpstart the battery. They all agree that's the best plan they have, so Bill and Joel push the truck and Ellie drives it. They try pushing the truck down the driveway, but it doesn't work out.
Now, hit it! Hit it!
Perfect. Hey, good job, kid.
Bill, not helping. Ellie, we're gonna give it another go. Stay focused.
They push again, trying to get the truck to the hill at the end of the street, fighting off more infected along the way. Eventually, they push it down the hill and manage to get it started. Joel and Bill hop in the back, and Ellie floors it down the street to escape the infected.
Go, more!
After driving for a while, Bill tells Ellie to stop so he can get out. Joel tells Bill that he's sorry about what happened to his friend, to which Bill just asks if they're even. Joel says, yes, they're even. Then Bill just coldly tells him to get out of his town and walks off. One thing I like about The Last of Us is the fact that all the side characters are essential to the character development of either Joel or Ellie. After Sarah's death, Tommy likely acted as Joel's anchor. After they had a falling out and Tommy left Joel, that role was likely passed along to Tess. Now that Tess is gone, that role now goes to Ellie. Sparing you all the psychobabble bullshit, Joel obviously has problems with getting close to people. Because this world he lives in is dangerous, and he's afraid of experiencing loss by having someone who he cares about die like Sarah did, but he can still bring himself to get close to people given time. As a character, Bill is meant to be the type of person that Joel could turn into without someone to act as an anchor. Bill is very untrusting of people, he's good at surviving, and he's quarantined off an entire town to himself. Bill had a partner like Joel always had, and they seem to have had a falling out the same way Joel and Tommy did. Except when Joel had a falling out with Tommy, and Tommy left Boston, Joel still had Tess to fall back on. With Bill and Frank living in this town all by themselves, when Frank left Bill, he had no one to lean on. Bill, in the same way as Joel, is scared of getting close to people because he's scared of experiencing loss if they die or leave him. Except with Bill, this is taken to an extreme with him being paranoid and untrusting of everyone. Before leaving the house with the truck, Bill suggests searching the rest of the place for any supplies Frank may have left behind. You can find Frank's suicide note in another room. It reads the following. Well, Bill, I doubt you'd ever find this note because you were too scared to ever make it to this part of town. But if for some reason you did, I want you to know I hated your guts. I grew tired of this shitty town and of your set-in-your-ways attitude. I wanted more from life than this, and you could never get that. And that stupid battery you kept moaning about? I got it. But I guess you were right. Trying to leave this town will kill me. Still better than spending another day with you. Good luck, Frank.
Seriously, you gotta take that kid back to where you found her.
I can't just take her back.
Then send her packing, let her find her own way. Look, let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, I had somebody that I cared about. A partner. Somebody I had to look after. And in this world, that sort of shit's good for one thing. Getting you killed. So you know what I did? I wisened the fuck up. And I realized it's gotta be just me.
This clearly doesn't make any sense from a practical standpoint. It's obviously better to have someone watching your back if the goal is to increase your chances of survival. The likely reason Bill came to this conclusion is because he sees getting close to people as bad. So in his mind, he's better off surviving in this town alone, setting up barricades and traps to give himself something to do and surviving for the sake of surviving. After Bill had his falling out with Frank and he left the town, Bill decided he doesn't want to risk getting close to someone else. So that way, he doesn't have to experience the grief that comes with loss when and if they die in this dangerous new world. And then Bill finds out that Frank died before he had the chance to leave town. And as a result, he experiences grief. So as sad as it is, Bill probably sees this as proof that he was right to think this way all along.
Bill, I found this in there and I figured you should have it.
So that's how you feel. Well, fuck you too, Frank. Fucking idiot. You ready to go?
Back to Joel and Ellie at the start of Chapter 5. This is one of the longer chapters, and with the exception of one area in particular, you'll be fighting nothing but human enemies for the duration of the whole chapter. They drive along for a while until they reach Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Joel drives through the city and sees a man stumbling down the road who appears to be hurt. But it's actually a trap, and Joel sees right through it. After crashing and fighting off the bandits, the truck is totaled, so they have to go the rest of the way on foot. They go into a nearby building where they see that the hunters that just tried to kill them have already killed a lot of people, likely who've fallen into the same trap that they did, and they didn't fare as well. After leaving the building, Joel sees a bridge off in the distance which appears to be the Fort Duquesne Bridge. They decide to try and go across it to get out of the city. They walk down the road until they find the entrance to an abandoned quarantine zone. They go in and cut through a bookstore and a hotel filled with more hunters, but Joel and Ellie get separated in the hotel elevator shaft.
Joel!
I'm all right! Are you okay?
No! You scared the shit out of me!
Joel swims through half the basement, and the other half of the basement is one of my favorite areas in the game because it's clearly one of the scariest. After making your way out of the basement, you'll find more hunters. You get ambushed by one of them that then tries to drown Joel, but Ellie shows up and shoots the guy in the head and saves him.
I shot the hell out of that guy, huh?
Yeah, you sure did.
I feel sick.
At first, Joel's reaction is that of a stern parent, but after finding their way out of the hotel, Joel admits that she saved him, gives her a rifle, and shows her how to use it. At this point, Joel is starting to treat Ellie less like cargo and more like a partner. The following gameplay sequence in the financial district outside the hotel is another area where the story gets in the way of the gameplay. Joel goes down to the courtyard to kill the hunters guarding the area while Ellie covers Joel from the scaffolding with a rifle. If you try to take out all the enemies using stealth, the game will just keep spawning more and more. It turns out it's impossible to completely stealth your way through this section. The game needs the player to get caught because the cinematic cutscene that plays after fighting the hunters implies that Ellie fired the rifle at least once. So the player needs to get caught so Ellie can fire the rifle so the preceding cutscene can make sense. It's totally unacceptable for the game to do something like this. They should have either had two slightly different cutscenes or made it so that Joel got caught automatically, like what they did in front of the school in Billstown, which wasn't exactly an elegant solution, but it was still leaps better than the one that's here. They go a little further and see an armored Humvee with a machine gun turret on the back shoot two other survivors.
Oh shit, get down, get down.
They go through more of the city, avoiding more hunters until they're eventually spotted and chased by the Humvee, but they manage to lose it by cutting through some nearby apartments.
Joel, stop! Look.
Leave him alone.
This is where we're introduced to our next new characters, two brothers named Henry and Sam. They were part of a larger group, but they got separated after entering the city and getting ambushed by the hunters. Henry says that they should go to a safe area where the hunters won't find them so they can talk more. They go down some stairs, cut through an old toy store, through a back alley, and deal with a few hunters to get there. Once they make it, Henry explains that him and his brother are looking for the Fireflies to join up with them, same as Joel and Ellie. Henry says that there's a radio station outside the city, and his group all agreed that if they got separated, they'll meet up there. But first they need to get across a bridge, which is guarded by hunters manning a checkpoint. They decide to try to get through the checkpoint once it's dark out. Before moving on from Pittsburgh, I want to talk about some of the optional storytelling that can be pieced together if you explore the level enough. When the player goes through the entrance to the quarantine zone, there's an optional conversation where Ellie comments on some of the graffiti sprayed on the walls.
Give us our rations. Why wouldn't they give them their food?
Sometimes they ran out. Most times they just held on to it.
That never happened in Boston.
Trust me, it happened all the time.
You can find other anti-military graffiti scattered around the area as well, just like the graffiti that was back in the Boston quarantine zone. In the same area where Ellie comments on the graffiti, there's also a note that was left by what seems to be a soldier talking about a big battle that they lost. In the bookstore, there's 3 more notes. One is a checklist for letting people into the zone. At first glance, the second one appears to be a wanted poster, but the word executed is written over the faces. The poster was left there as a warning. The people on the poster were all deemed traitors by the military and were executed. The third note is from the military leader of the quarantine zone, explaining that there was a rebellion against the military and over the course of 14 months they've lost so many men that they're having trouble holding on to the quarantine zone. Behind the bookstore, there's the skeletons of 3 military soldiers that were left strung up by the rebels.
Man, you gotta be crazy to string up soldiers.
You get people desperate enough, they'll do just about anything.
And the people that rose up, they're the ones we've been fighting here?
That'd be my bet.
Go a little further and you can find a note in a coffee shop across the street from the hotel. The note appears to be from some rebels that are planning to take one of the military checkpoints. They stashed some supplies at an apartment building marked with a red X. Look around the street and you'll find a door marked with a red X that's also one of those doors that needs a shiv to open it. One thing I like is how this door is placed. Because of the old truck sitting next to it, it's essentially sitting around a blind corner. Some players who explore the street thoroughly might get rewarded by finding that door before they're supposed to. Otherwise, you'll have to backtrack to find it. Get inside and you can find a bunch of supplies and another note. This one is from a disgruntled mother. Her son was executed by the military after being labeled a traitor for joining a protest. In her anger, she joins the rebels and says that she's determined to get revenge on the military no matter what the cost.
With that kind of thinking, no one wins.
In the financial plaza outside the hotel, after Joel gives Ellie a rifle, you can find another note. Go into one of the restaurants and there's a blood trail on the floor that leads to an old backroom freezer. Inside, there are 3 tied-up skeletons that are from now long-dead Fireflies. They came to Pittsburgh trying to inspire the people living there to rebel, and likely join up with the Fireflies afterwards. The rebels decided to kill them and rule the city themselves instead. Go a little further and there's another note from the rebels saying that they're getting ready for the final battle, and anyone who doesn't show up to fight will be exiled. Keep going and you find another note that says the leader of the QZ military was captured by the rebels and burnt alive. In the area where you find this note, just go down the street a little and you can find the site of the final battle.
Jeez. I guess this is how it ended for this zone.
Well, every battle's got a losing side.
What if they had families?
Everyone has a family. Best not to dwell on it.
There's also another note from another rebel saying that the military has been defeated, but most of the military's equipment was damaged in the fighting, except an armored Humvee with a .50 caliber machine gun, the same one that was stalking you throughout the city.
What the hell? Oh, this place is bad.
After that, Joel and Ellie come across a place where the military keeps kids in the QZ with no parents.
I stayed at a place like this, back in the Boston QZ.
Military preparatory school.
Yeah, nice way of saying orphanage. I wonder what happened to all these kids.
Oh, this place has been out for a good stretch. They ain't kids no more.
Meaning they're either hunters trying to kill us, or they're dead.
Or they got away.
But you don't believe that.
I believe in getting out of this city. Come on.
After meeting Henry and Sam, they say that they were from a quarantine zone that had people rebelling just like this one did, and that's why they left. The last note that you find is one that explains how the rebels became hunters. A bunch of teenagers were put on trial after killing a family of people for supplies. The people in attendance were expecting the teenagers to be punished, but instead the leader said that they should all take turns hunting survivors for supplies just like they did, and the few people who dared to speak out against this decision were killed. It's interesting that as you progress through the city, you learn more about the rebels overthrowing the military. And the more you learn, the more you realize that they eventually turned into the very thing that they were fighting against.
Whoa, Nelly. Harsh punishment.
Shit, it ain't that much different than what the military does back in Boston.
I guess not.
Later that night, Joel and the crew go outside and try to kill the hunters guarding the checkpoint. Hiding from that spotlight while weaving in and out of cover was fun, but it turns out it was also a bit unnecessary. The design of this area feels a bit sloppy because it's set up as to where it feels like it should be possible to do using stealth. If you get to the checkpoint gate doors, the game won't let you proceed until you kill all the guards, which is extremely hard to do without getting spotted. One's patrolling the front of the checkpoint on the ground, and the other two are up top. One is operating a spotlight and the other's firing at clickers with a rifle. I say firing at them, he's usually not hitting them, and that's okay because these clickers are super polite, and will just fall down so as not to hurt the shooter's feelings when he misses. You can kill the guy on the ground without getting spotted, but there's no way to kill one of the two guys up top without alerting the other since they're standing directly next to each other. There's no way for players to get up top where they're at, and if the enemies get alerted, backup will immediately spawn in. Players can't use a bow to stealth kill them because if you shoot one, the other will be alerted. They won't respond to bricks and bottles making noise when thrown like most enemies do, so you can't get them away from each other either. And since there's no way to get up to where they're at, Joel and Henry can't do a tag team stealth takedown like they did earlier. You can get to the generator that's powering the spotlight and turn it off. Doing so will make the two guards come down from their perch and do a sweep of the area, but another 4 hunters will spawn in and do the same. Since they're very tightly packed together in this area they're patrolling, it's almost impossible to kill them all without getting spotted. Combat here is clearly the easiest option because of the way everything's set up. For the most part, the designs of the levels are well made. I found that even the most linear of levels would still be set up to push players in the right direction without being too forceful, with this level being an exception. Much like the scene with Ellie and the rifle earlier, the player is supposed to fail at stealthing this. So that way the sound of the gunshots can attract the Humvee to come investigate. So that way the following chase sequence can commence, so the pre-rendered cutscene at the end of the chase sequence can make sense. This is better than before when the game just lets the player think that they can beat this section with pure stealth when really it's impossible, letting them stealth kill enemies using arrows and other resources while the game spawns in other enemies endlessly until they're caught. But the overly contrived level design here is another example of the game not allowing players to beat the area with their preferred playstyle for the sake of the story. Anyway, they get through the checkpoint doors just as that armored Humvee shows up. Henry, Sam, and Ellie climb over a large truck, but the ladder breaks off before Joel can climb up. The Humvee starts breaking through the checkpoint doors, but Henry, fearing for Sam's safety, runs off with him, leaving Joel behind. Ellie, however, jumps back down to Joel, saying that she's sticking with him. They run over to a shutter and open it just as the Humvee breaks through the doors, and Joel gets inside just as the turret starts firing. After fighting their way through this building, they get back outside. They run down an off-ramp towards the bridge as the Humvee shoots and chases after them. They make it to the bridge and it turns out it's destroyed. This is another problem I have. Why would the hunters waste their presumably limited manpower and resources to guard a checkpoint for a bridge that's out? Maybe the checkpoint itself is a good chill spot or something? I don't know. Anyway, the bridge is out and the Humvee is right behind them. They're trapped and Joel is trying to come up with a plan. Ellie suggests jumping into the river. Joel says it's too high, plus she can't swim. But Ellie is like, screw it, and jumps in anyway. Joel follows after her. Joel wakes up on a beach at the beginning of Chapter 6 with Ellie, Sam, and Henry standing there. Joel isn't exactly happy to see Henry after he left him behind and threatens to shoot him. But Henry manages to convince Joel to let it go after Ellie tells him that he saved them from drowning. After that, they all brush themselves off and continue to the radio station. They walk along the beach until they make it to a sewer grate. Seeing no other way forward, they all climb inside. They navigate through the old sewer tunnels for a while until they find a part of the sewer that's been turned into a camp. After looking around, you see that the camp has clearly been abandoned for a while, with the only occupying residents now being the infected. At one point, Joel accidentally triggers a trap and they get separated from each other. I like how Sam got stuck on the side with Joel and how Ellie got stuck on the side with Henry.
So, this is awkward.
Ellie and Henry get chased off by a pack of clickers, and when the clickers run past the gate, Joel motions Sam to be quiet for some reason. There's a gate between them and the clickers that can't be opened, so why doesn't he just make some noise to distract them so Ellie and Henry can get away easier? I don't know, whatever. So they're separated and now Joel and Sam need to go through this next area together. This area is extremely hard to sneak through because the infected here are stalkers, which are stage 2 infected caught in the halfway point between a runner and a clicker. They have the hearing of a clicker, but they can still see like a runner. This makes them the hardest enemy to sneak past. All the other enemy types, runners, clickers, and bloaters, look and sound distinct and are easy to identify. Stalkers look like runners with more fungus growing on their heads than normal, which is why I bet that some players will confuse them for clickers when first seeing them. Runners yell and make incoherent babbling noises, whereas clickers make their high-pitched clicking noises. Stalkers do a combination of both. The visual and audio language with stalkers is much more muddy, especially from a distance. Gameplay-wise, what separates stalkers from other infected is that they'll hide around corners and try to ambush the player, hence the name Stalker. It's a neat idea, but they don't play any different than a runner in stealth sections. They only duck in and out of cover during combat sequences when all the infected in the area are alerted to your presence. Plus, they never stick around long enough to make a difference anyway. The only areas where the stalkers are used in the whole game are the hotel basement back in Pittsburgh and this sewer level. This is probably because they're a confusing enemy, so they just never got to see much of any use. But this segues me into another problem, which is the fact that the infected don't match up with their in-game continuity. When Joel and the gang enter the sewer base, they get attacked by some of the infected. After dealing with them, Joel says that since there was a clicker amongst them, the sewer base must have been abandoned for a long time. But this makes no sense because the sewer settlement has clearly been abandoned for years, since the bodies of the people who live there have been pretty much fully skeletonized, which typically takes a few years. This is likely because the timeline for the different stages of infection doesn't match up with what's seen in the game itself. According to the in-game lore, there are 4 different stages of infection. Everyone who gets infected succumbs to stage 1 of infection first within 2 days. Stage 1 is becoming a runner. A few weeks or a month after getting infected, they become a stage 2 stalker. A year after being infected, they become a stage 3 clicker. And after a decade of being infected, they reach stage 4 and become a bloater. Keep in mind, we're experiencing this 20 years after the cordyceps infection started running rampant. In a later chapter, Joel finds a note left by the military that says more than 60% of the human race has been either infected or killed by the cordyceps. The note can be found in an area that looks like it's been abandoned for quite a few years, possibly well over a decade. After 2 decades, the 2 most common infected enemy types in The Last of Us should be the clickers and bloaters, with runners and stalkers being the most rare. But for some reason, the 2 most common infected enemy types are clickers and runners, which makes no sense. After such a long time, most of the infected should have reached stage 3 and 4 of infection by now. Much like the in-game description of the clickers versus their actual behavior, this is another example of the in-game description of the infected not matching up with how they're actually portrayed.
Jeez. What was up with that big guy?
He's been infected for a long time. We call them bloaters.
Bloater. Okay, got it.
I hate to interrupt your little biology lesson, but can we get the fuck out of here, please?
Eventually, Joel, Sam, Ellie, and Henry get reunited and chased by a large group of infected. They hit a dead end when they run into a room with a door that's blocked. They have Sam and Ellie crawl through a small window to open the door from the other side. Even though that window looks big enough for Henry and Joel to crawl through, just get a chair or something to stand on. Anyway, while they're doing that, you're stuck in this room fighting off infected until the door opens. The game will have supplies in the room waiting for you to pick up. Depending on the difficulty you have the game set to, it will vary as to what the supplies are. On the easier difficulties, it will be stuff like ammo for your guns, a nail bomb, and a baseball bat. But on the harder difficulties, it might just be a Molotov and a plank of wood. After fighting the infected for a hot minute, Ellie and Sam finally get the door open.
Fresh air.
Look at this.
Oh, are you fucking kidding me? Thanks for the warning on the other side, guys.
So where's this tower?
We're close. Come on, let's go.
They go down a trail and into a nearby suburb where they see the radio tower off in the distance. Out of all the comm sections, I feel the suburbs was the most enjoyable one for me. The nice change in scenery is refreshing after being stuck underground for so long, and the whole area is filled with stuff to see and do. There's several optional conversations, plenty of stuff to scavenge, some dogs play fighting in the street, a workbench, a fun eye-rolling moment with Ellie's pun book, another fun moment involving a dartboard, and an attic with a training manual in it that I wager a lot of players missed on their first playthrough. There's even a few notes, including some that are tied into the story surrounding that settlement back in the sewers. That area has more optional storytelling, just like the one about the rebellion back in Pittsburgh, except this one is better in my opinion. I say that because of the amount of detail that can be seen in the environment while going through the area. Stuff like the rules on how to shower, as to save water written on the walls. Large sections of the settlement have things like kids' toys, and there's even a few cribs. Sam even comments that it looks like a classroom. You can tell just by the way it looks that a lot of kids lived here. Back on the beach, while scavenging on a wrecked fishing boat, you can find a note written by the boat's former captain, a guy named Ish. He went out to sea after the outbreak started and lived out there for a few months fishing for his food. I don't know how he ended up near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, because there's no river that directly connects to any ocean near that city, but I might be looking too much into it. After a while, he decided to return to land since his boat was pretty beaten up. After going into the sewers, you find another note from Ish that basically says the outside is dangerous and he's turning the sewers into a camp. Another note talks about how he traded with some people outside and he wanted to invite them to stay with him because they had kids. Not too far off from finding that note, you'll find a door with a castle painted over it. It looks like a child drew it. Inside the settlement, you can find a room with some rain catchers for collecting water with another note from Ish. At this point, Ish and the others have been living in this place together for a while. There were at least 3 other adults named Kyle, Susan, and Danny, as well as an unknown number of other people, a lot of which were kids. There's another room with a few dead bodies and the words, "They didn't suffer," written on the floor. A note written by Kyle explains that he and some of the children got trapped inside the room with infected pounding at the door, and he was forced to mercy kill them all. Back outside in the suburbs, there's another note from Kyle that he wrote before moving into the sewers with Ish. It says the neighborhood outside was getting too dangerous, and Kyle was considering taking his family and moving in with a guy that he's been trading with, that of course being Ish. But since we've already been through that area, we know how that worked out.
Well, that wasn't a good idea, now was it?
The last note involving Ish and his people is the one from after he and a few other survivors escaped after their camp was overrun with infected. Apparently the reason the camp got overrun with infected is because someone just forgot to close a door. All it took was one unsecure exit for a whole bunch of those guys to come crawling in. Ish, Susan, and some of the other kids escaped, barricaded the exit, and wrote the warning on the wall. You never learn what happens to them. After Ish wrote that note, they all supposedly just left and went off to try and survive someplace else.
Look at this place. It's like a classroom. Why couldn't they keep it safe?
Son, I wish I knew. God knows they didn't deserve it.
After finishing up with the suburbs, the next one-off sequence involves Joel and the crew getting pinned down by a sniper. Joel tells the others to stay put so he can sneak up and get the drop on him. The sniper is located inside the 3rd floor window of a house at the far end of the street. Getting there will involve ducking in and out of cover and cutting through some backyards and houses. I like how when you get to the far end of the street and kill the hunters acting as backup for the sniper, there's a path the player can take so they can loot the houses on the other side of the street if they want to. My first instinct for dealing with the sniper was to get as close to him as possible and shoot him. But it turns out you can't do that. For some reason, there's no character model manning the gun, and the gun model itself doesn't even rotate to aim at the player before firing. In a game so flushed with details, this really threw me off when I first saw it. At first I thought I was seeing the game bug out. That's how confused I was. This probably happens because the player is supposed to go into the house and up to the room where the sniper is. Once you do that, there's an in-game cutscene that plays with a QuickTime event where the player needs to mash squares so Joel can kill the sniper by hand. This is another instance of the game taking away the ability for the player to complete a task the way they want for the sake of the story. Except this may be the worst offender. It's confusing, immersion-shattering, and inconsistent with the meticulous attention to detail that's present in the rest of the game. Once you kill the sniper, Joel mans the rifle himself to cover the others. It doesn't make any sense for the hunters to throw themselves into a meat grinder like this. This is the only point in the game where the human enemy's sense of self-preservation is gone. Regardless, this part is a really satisfying power trip. The rifle has infinite ammo, which adds to the feeling. After a little while, the armored Humvee shows up again. It turns out these are the same hunters from Pittsburgh, which means that they either knew which direction you were headed and set a trap for you, or that they're trying to ambush people even all the way out here. The sniper has no effect on the truck. You can try shooting the tires or shooting the driver through the little slits over the front of the windows, but it won't work. When the machine gun runs out of ammo, the guy manning it stupidly opens the hatch up top and starts throwing Molotovs at the group. I already said I like this sequence in a general sense, but the temporary power trip it gives comes at the cost of the human enemies displaying any semblance of common sense. Anyway, the guy pops his head out, you shoot him, he drops his Molotov into the truck lights on fire, explodes, and crashes. The hunters are all beaten, but the noise from the fighting attracts the infected. 2 clickers attack Henry and Sam. You shoot one and Ellie shoots the other. After dealing with that, they all run towards the house where you're at. Joel tries to stop the infected by shooting them as they run towards the house, but eventually there's so many of them that he's obviously just wasting his time. It's kind of a shame that we weren't able to take the truck because, I felt like they owed us a truck. But it was also kind of a shame and also kind of bullshit that we couldn't take the sniper rifle with us. Joel goes downstairs to meet the others and they all escape the house through the back, going the rest of the way to the radio tower on foot. The game fast forwards a little to after they make it to the tower. Joel and Henry are making small talk when Henry mentions that he doesn't think anyone else from his group is going to show up. Joel agrees, and Henry's worried about needing to explain that to Sam. Meanwhile, Sam and Ellie are in the next room talking. Sam seems to think that Henry sent Ellie to check up on him, to make sure that he's not messing something up. Sam asks her why she never seems to be afraid of anything. She says she is, and one of her biggest fears is ending up alone. Sam says one of his biggest fears is becoming one of the infected, believing that they might still be alive and totally conscious but having no control of their bodies. After they finish talking, Ellie gives him the toy robot that he tried to take when they passed through the toy store back in Pittsburgh, but Henry wouldn't let him, saying that we only take what we can carry. I do like how back in the toy store you can see when Ellie picks up the robot, but she won't do it while you're watching. Nice little detail there. After Ellie says goodnight and leaves the room, Sam shows that he's been bitten. The only time this could have happened is when they were jumped by clickers during the sniper section. The next day, Ellie wakes up to Joel and Henry cooking breakfast. Henry tells Ellie to wake up Sam so he can eat with them, but by this time he's already turned. He attacks Ellie, Henry shoots him, and then he commits guilt-ridden suicide. After he shoots himself, the game cuts to black, marking the end of the chapter. Before moving on, I want to talk about Henry and Sam's role in the game's story. On the surface, they seem to have the kind of relationship that Joel and Ellie should want to have. Henry, being the older brother, looks out for both of them and teaches Sam how to survive. And Sam clearly looks up to Henry, relying on him for guidance. But the problem with their relationship is that Henry doesn't give him any direct responsibilities. This makes Sam feel like he's his brother's burden, creating a trust issue between the two. Sam may be younger and more inexperienced than Henry, but he's still a survivor like his brother. However, Henry doesn't seem to be willing to accept this, treating Sam as his charge rather than his less experienced partner in survival. The reason that Sam asks Ellie about fear is because he's always afraid. Henry never lets him help out with the group, and instead he's expected to always play follow the leader. Because of that, he has no self-confidence and sees himself as just another mouth to feed. It's no coincidence that Joel and Ellie meet Henry and Sam shortly after Joel decides to trust Ellie enough to give her a gun. Bill was meant to be a warning to Joel about what he could become if he sinks too far into his cold and pessimistic attitude. Sam and Henry are meant to be a warning to Joel and Ellie that they need to trust each other as partners. This requires Ellie to be willing to listen to Joel's advice on how to survive, and Joel needs to not only show Ellie how to survive, but actually let her help out with surviving. It doesn't matter if Joel wants to keep their relationship from getting personal or not. If they want to finish this journey together, they need to trust each other. Essentially, this pushes Ellie further into growing up and maturing, as well as pushing Joel further into his role as Ellie's surrogate father. If he kept going down his cold and distant survivor streak, he could end up like Bill. But if he lets his relationship with Ellie get personal, and doesn't help train her to be a competent survivor, he may end up facing an end similar to Henry's. After Sam and Henry die, we go to Chapter 7, which involves skipping ahead multiple months to when Ellie and Joel finally make it to where Tommy's supposed to be. This is another problem I have with the game. There are 3 of these time skips that fast forward over full seasons, glossing over big chunks of Ellie and Joel's relationship and character development. When Chapter 6 ends, Sam and Henry die tragically. And when Chapter 7 starts, Joel and Ellie are casually walking through the woods. And the deaths of Sam and Henry are never brought up again until the end of the game, with the exception of some optional dialogue near the beginning of Chapter 7.
That's too small.
I forgot to leave that stupid robot on his grave. What should I do with it?
Ellie.
What? I want to talk about it.
No.
Why not?
How many times do we need to go over this? Things happen, and we move on.
It's just...
That's enough.
You're right. I'm sorry.
Let's get to Tommy's.
I get that the developers may have had their hand forced with this choice. Because of the game's focus on realism, the journey would have likely taken multiple months on foot. And it wouldn't have been reasonable to expect the game to take multiple real-world months to complete. These large time skips are likely to help preserve that realism without needing to make the game unreasonably lengthy. And for the most part, it works to preserve the realism. But as far as making us bond with the characters, skipping from one important story event over to another kind of feels like cheating. Anyway, the opening to Chapter 7 has you walking along the river through the Rocky Mountains of Wyoming. Along the way, Ellie asks Joel about Tommy, pointing out that since they're not together, something must have happened between the two of them. This is where Joel confirms that he and Tommy had a falling out. His last words to Joel were, "I don't want to ever see your goddamn face again." After that, he apparently left Boston and came all the way out here. This is another thing that's left unexplained. How did Joel know that this is where Tommy was? I assume that they didn't call or write to each other since there's no mail or phones. Did Tommy tell Joel or someone else where he was going before he left? That seems unlikely given how their relationship ended on a sour note. Were his last words to Joel, "I don't ever want to see your goddamn face again, and by the way, I'll be in this random small town in Wyoming if you ever want to catch up"? Also, why did Tommy pick this place to go after leaving Boston? A small town in the middle of the mountains out in Wyoming seems kind of like a random place to go. The only thing that makes sense in my mind is while Joel and Tommy were out surviving in the world, they passed through this town at some point, and something about it stuck out to them. But instead of staying, they left for some reason, and Tommy must have been talking frequently to Joel about how he wants to go back. Much like Joel's piss-poor excuse earlier for not going back to the quarantine zone in Boston, it wouldn't have been hard to come up with an explanation for this. I just wish it was explained more thoroughly. Or at all, really. They follow the river for a while and come across a hydroelectric power plant.
Whoa, what's that?
Right there's a hydroelectric power plant.
A hydro
It uses the river's movement and turns it into electricity.
How does it do that?
Look, I know what it is. I don't know how it does it.
They try opening the gates to cut through it, but it turns out the place is already occupied.
Don't even think about reaching for your weapon. Tell the girl to drop hers now.
For once, though, it's not hunters. These guys are Tommy's people.
They're all right.
But you know these people?
Know him. He's my goddamn brother.
Tommy.
Holy shit.
How you doing, baby brother?
God damn.
Yeah.
Let me look at you. You get fucking old.
Easy. It's gonna happen to you, too.
They go into the plant, and it turns out they have a whole settlement here and are trying to get the dam working so they can have electricity. Ellie goes with Tommy's wife Maria to get something to eat, and while Tommy is giving Joel the tour, he tells him that sometime after leaving Boston, he went back to Texas to see if any of their stuff was left. After so long, most of it was obviously long gone, but he did manage to find a picture of him and Sarah. He offers to give it to Joel, but he says he doesn't want it.
It's a little faded, but it still looks pretty good.
When Joel is offered the picture, the player has the opportunity to interact by pressing a button, but pressing that button will make Joel reject the picture.
I'm good.
You sure?
I've said I'm good.
There's a good reason for this. The game is doing this to remind players that they aren't playing as themselves. They're playing as Joel. And anything that the player is allowed to do while playing as Joel is something that Joel would do. After finishing up the tour and seeing the workers getting the power plant working again, Joel and Tommy go into a room to talk privately. Joel tells Tommy that Ellie's immune to the cordyceps and he's trying to get her to the Firefly's lab. We also find out that Joel doesn't just want Tommy to tell him where the lab is. He's also trying to convince Tommy to take Ellie there himself. Joel is intending to just leave Ellie with Tommy and be on his way. Tommy refuses, and this causes Joel and Tommy to start arguing over past problems. However, their arguing gets interrupted when hunters attack the dam facility. Joel and Tommy run outside, and you need to help him and his people fight off the attackers. Or rather, they need to help you fight off the attackers. Once again, the lackluster AI becomes a problem here. This should be another cathartic moment like the sniper scene, where the player gets to fight with a couple of other guys who know what they're doing, instead of needing to handle fights by themselves, aided occasionally by the mostly inexperienced Ellie. But the enemy AI will hyper-focus on you, ignoring most of the other threats. Which is fair because Tommy and his guys are pretty much useless during this fight. There's Tommy himself plus 2 other guys. All 3 of them have rifles. It takes 4 shots from one of their rifles to kill a single hunter, and they only seem to hit their target like once out of every 6 or 7 shots. Needless to say, you'll be doing like 90% of the fighting. After fighting off the hunters and reuniting with Ellie, Tommy has a change of heart. He has an argument with his wife about taking Ellie to the Fireflies. Ellie sees Tommy and Maria arguing. She starts to understand what's going on and marches off. After the argument, Tommy tells Joel that he'll take Ellie to the Fireflies. But then someone radios in saying that Ellie stole one of the horses and ran off. She likely did this to see if Joel cared enough to come chase after her. Ellie running off after getting upset is another case of the game reminding us that she's still just a kid, so she doesn't always react to situations in a way that seems responsible. Joel and Tommy get on their own horses and give chase. I don't think it's fair to call the horse riding section another one-off sequence like the sniper section or the upside down section, because it's present once in Chapter 7, once in Chapter 9, and takes up a large majority of Chapter 8. The horse riding mechanics were clearly ripped straight from Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception, which was Naughty Dog's previous title. While following Ellie's trail, Joel and Tommy run into another hunter ambush. After swiftly dealing with them, they get back to following the horse tracks, which leads them to an old abandoned ranch house. Joel goes into the house and finds Ellie upstairs. The following conversation is one of the most important ones in the game. At first, Joel scolds Ellie for running off. Then they argue over Joel trying to ditch her. That's when Ellie says that Maria told her about Sarah.
Not her, you know.
What?
Maria told me about Sarah.
Ellie?
And
You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
I'm sorry about your daughter, Joel, but I have lost people too.
You have no idea what loss is.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you. So don't tell me that I would be safer with someone else, because the truth is I would just be more scared.
You're right. You're not my daughter. I sure as hell ain't your dad.
This is meant to be the lowest point between the two characters. Joel is understandably scared of going through loss again, and Ellie, as she said earlier during her conversation with Sam, is scared of ending up alone. And now that she's formed a relationship with Joel, she doesn't want to lose it. Their conversation gets interrupted, however, when hunters attack the house. After dealing with them, they leave, and it's a long, silent ride back to Tommy's town. Once they get there, Joel asks where the Firefly lab is. Tommy says that it's in the science building at the University of Eastern Colorado. Joel tells Ellie to give Tommy his horse back, and he's going to hold on to the horse that he's riding, apparently changing his mind, deciding to take Ellie to the Fireflies himself anyway. He doesn't apologize to her. She seems to just know that what he's doing is his way of saying sorry. Fast forward ahead to what seems to be a few days or a week later at the start of Chapter 8. They make it to the University of Eastern Colorado, somewhere near the city of Boulder, Colorado. By the way, the University of Eastern Colorado isn't a real place, but it's modeled after the Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. At least 2/3 of the chapter will involve riding around on the horse for a while, occasionally getting off to scavenge for supplies or find a way around a gate, which will involve getting around some infected. There's also a few quieter moments here as well. You get to see some monkeys. There's a few notes left from the students that were staying at the university dormitory. Ellie comes up with a terrible name for the horse.
Stay, Callus. What kind of name is Callus anyways?
Not my fault you forgot to ask Tommy his name.
Callus.
There's even a nice moment where Joel opens up about himself, and when Ellie pries too much, instead of stonewalling her, Joel lightly tells her to back off.
Have you ever been to one of these?
What, university?
Yeah.
No, not as a student, at least.
Why not?
I had Sarah when I was pretty young.
Were you married?
For a while.
What happened?
Okay.
Too much?
Too much.
When they first enter the university, they don't see any fireflies. There's signs of a lookout, an old camp, and a few other indicators, but no fireflies. When they get to the science building, there's a bunch of guard towers, but no guards. They find a way inside the building, and it seems the place has been abandoned. There's a moment where it looks like Ellie and Joel are being stalked by something, but it's just a fake out with some monkeys. While searching the place, there's some tape recorders you can find that seem to have been recorded by one of the Fireflies. The first one has the guy on the tape talking about the Firefly leaders having concerns about security. The second one has him talking about moving out of the lab. Apparently, the monkeys used to be lab monkeys. The cordyceps can infect monkeys, but it doesn't cause them to go insane and turn into clickers like it does with humans. The Firefly says that he's supposed to put down the infected monkeys before leaving. He doesn't want to, though, opting to just release them instead. But when he opens one of the cages, the monkey panics and bites him.
I'm sure glad we didn't mess with them monkeys.
He didn't say where they went.
I know, let's just keep looking.
You go into a room and find the skeleton of the Firefly that got bit. It looks like he shot himself in the head so he wouldn't turn. Joel finds another recording near his body. Listening to the previous recordings is optional, but listening to this one is mandatory to further the story. I like how Joel fast-forwards through this recording in the cutscene, but you can access it in your inventory and listen to the whole thing later for players who want to do that. From the recording, they find out that the Fireflies moved the lab to Salt Lake City, Utah. Then they're attacked by hunters.
Fireflies?
Get down!
Oh!
After fighting their way through the hospital, Joel gets jumped by one of them and gets badly injured.
Oh man. Joel?
I'm gonna need you to pull.
Okay. Alright, you ready? 1, 2, 3! Here.
Let's get to the damn horse.
Okay.
You limp out of the hospital with Ellie covering you and Joel bleeding all over the place. I like this scene because it shows just how much Ellie cares for Joel, especially in contrast to the end of the last chapter when Ellie stole Tommy's horse and ran off, which showed that Joel cared for Ellie. Plus, none of it's being done in a cutscene, and the player has full control of the character the whole time, adding to the overall effectiveness. They make it outside, get on the horse, and ride off. After leaving the campus, Joel passes out from blood loss and falls off the horse. The screen cuts to black, ending Chapter 8, and we have yet another time skip, once again in the middle of a pivotal story moment. However, this time skip does end up getting a bit of a redemption later thanks to the DLC, where we get to see how Ellie saved Joel's life. But we'll talk about that later. Fast forward a few months to winter and the start of Chapter 9. During this chapter, the game switches gears, giving us control of Ellie. The start of Chapter 9 just has you crouching through a forest trying to hunt deer with a bow and arrow. You need to shoot the deer twice to kill it, but you need to get close enough to hit it. This will involve crouch walking through the forest and trying to avoid stepping on any branches as not to make any noise. Startling it will make it run away and you'll have to follow it through its tracks in the snow. This deer scene has a few different purposes. First of all, it's another calm moment to contrast against all the action. Secondly, it's to get the players acclimated to the idea of playing as Ellie. Third, it's to keep players in suspense of what happened to Joel. When we last saw him, he was badly injured and had just passed out from blood loss, with Ellie panicking and having no idea what to do. The game is lingering on the question of whether or not he's still alive. After shooting the deer a second time, it runs off again. You follow the tracks to an old coal mine where you find that it bled to death. This is where we're introduced to our next new character, David. As well as James, but he's pretty inconsequential as a character. You could easily just swap him out for some random NPC and it wouldn't have changed the story at all. Nobody's gonna remember his name. So I'm just gonna stick to calling him David's friend. Upon seeing David and his friend, Ellie points her bow at them and warns them not to try anything funny. They approach Ellie and tell her that they're from a larger group with women and children. To which Ellie lies and says that she's also from a large group with women and children. David asks if they can trade her something for the deer. Ellie agrees to trade the deer for some medicine. Her asking them if they have any antibiotics is the first confirmation we get that Joel is still alive. David asks if she's okay with her following them to their settlement, to which Ellie refuses, instead insisting that David's friend goes to get the medicine himself and brings it back. David tells him to do that, so he does. Ellie asks for David's rifle, and he gives it to her without a fight. They go into one of the buildings to take shelter from the cold. David tries to make small talk with Ellie, but she's clearly not interested, constantly brushing him off. She's a lot more responsible and cautious acting than she was before, not being so trusting to a couple of strangers, showing that she's grown up quite a bit. But then a clicker runs into the room.
Another gun?
Sorry.
3 things here. First of all, why did they leave the door open? Secondly, why did that clicker just run into the room like that? And third, why didn't Ellie shoot at it when it charged her? She's holding a rifle and she's just standing there. Answer, she doesn't do anything so that way David can save her so the player will trust him more. It's really stupid and comes across as lazy writing. The next sequence is basically you and David trying to fight off waves of infected through the old coal mine. The purpose of this fight is to show that Ellie's not only matured quite a bit, but she's also a pretty competent survivor all by herself at this point. David even admits that Ellie's a better shot than he is.
You weren't kidding. You're a better shot with that thing than I am.
In another area, deeper in the mining complex, they get stuck with no clue how to proceed forward. Then Ellie ends up being the one that finds the way out, involving another ladder puzzle. And while fighting off the infected, a bloater shows up, and even David, a full-grown adult, admits he has no idea what it is.
It's a bloater! What? One of those big fucking guys!
After fighting off all the infected, Ellie and David return to the room with the deer in the campfire. At this point, both Ellie and the player are probably a lot more relaxed and trusting of David. That's when David tells Ellie in a pretty ominous way that the people that she and Joel killed at the university were part of his group, and he's just figured out who she is. That's when David's friend shows up again with the medicine and points a gun at Ellie. Obviously, he's furious with her, but David tells him to just give her the medicine and let her go. In spite of his initial protests, he reluctantly agrees to do so. Ellie takes the antibiotics and leaves. She goes back to the horse and rides to an area with a series of cabins. She has Joel hidden safely in the basement of one of them, and she's hiding the horse in the garage. She shows that she stitched up Joel's injury and gives him the antibiotics. Before, it was Joel's job to protect Ellie, and at this point the role of protector and protected have been reversed. Ellie falls asleep and wakes up later when she hears a noise outside. David's people apparently tracked her, so now she needs to lure them away from Joel. She gets on the horse and rides off with the hunters shooting at her. Eventually, one of them manages to shoot the horse. From here, you need to navigate through a series of cabins and either avoid or fight the hunters. I'm going to take the time to talk about the subtle gameplay changes that come with playing as Ellie as opposed to playing as Joel. Obviously, Ellie doesn't have all of Joel's upgrades and equipment. She's equipped with a bow, a rifle, her handgun, and later a shotgun if you kill one of the hunters and take it off their body. She can also craft Molotov cocktails, nail bombs, and smoke bombs the same as Joel. She probably learned how to make these things by watching Joel do it so many times. The shooting with Ellie is largely the same as it is with Joel, except the switch between Joel and Ellie will make it feel as though Ellie is less capable in combat, which is exactly how it should feel. Joel is obviously much more physically strong than Ellie, and at this point obviously players probably upgraded Joel quite a bit. The real changes are in the stealth and melee combat. Ellie can't use melee weapons like bats, pipes, planks of wood, axes, or machetes. She can't use bricks or bottles as melee weapons either, although she can throw them at enemies to stun them, and she also can't craft shivs. But she doesn't need shivs because she has her pocket knife, which will never break. She can use it to quickly kill any enemy that's stunned or distracted by pressing triangle. This happens both to human and infected enemies. The fact that Ellie's not very good at melee combat, that she has less guns and equipment than the players are used to, that she has less health than Joel, and that she can quickly stealth kill enemies continuously so long as she remains undetected, it's obvious the developers want players to use stealth as much as possible when playing as her. One thing, though, is that after playing as Ellie and seeing how much better it is to have a knife, it did make me sad to have to go back to playing as a knifeless Joel later. I know that I can't be the only one who's annoyed that while you're scrounging for supplies to craft a bunch of shivs, Ellie is holding that knife the whole time. More than anything, though, it's annoying that Joel seems to be totally cool with it. He could have said at one point, "Ellie, give me that knife, I need it more than you do," and she could have said back, "No, if you won't let me have a gun, then I need something to defend myself with." That would have been enough for me, because then they would have at least addressed it. It's cool how she'll sometimes use the knife to save Joel when he's grabbed by an enemy, but I still feel like Joel could have gotten more use out of the pocket knife overall than she does. Anyway, you fight through or sneak past the hunters, trying to circle around and make it back to Joel. But David shows up and you end up getting captured.
Relax. Keeping you alive here. There you go. There you go.
Ellie wakes up later in a makeshift jail cell to find out that David and his group are cannibals. Before, when you were trying to escape David's hunters, you hear them say several times that David ordered them to capture Ellie, not kill her. When David comes into the room and talks with Ellie again, the reason why he wanted to capture her and not kill her becomes much more clear, as it's very heavily implied that David is sexually attracted to the 14-year-old Ellie. Ellie pretends to go along with it for a second, only to try and escape in a way that only she would try. Meanwhile, back at the cabins, Joel wakes up after seeming to have mostly recovered from the infection brought on by his injury. He looks through the house for Ellie, but can't find her anywhere. He goes outside and finds more of David's hunters. Most of them seem to have left after Ellie got captured, but a few of them seem to have stayed behind. They immediately know who Joel is as soon as they see him and start shooting. If you kill a few of them, they'll fall back a little. It does this mostly as an excuse to set up the preceding QuickTime event where Joel knocks out 2 of the hunters. Joel drags them to a cabin where he interrogates them for Ellie's whereabouts. The game also takes this opportunity to remind players that Joel isn't a very nice guy.
What the? You wait here. Now, the girl. Is she alive?
What girl? I don't know no girl.
Fuck! Focus right here, right here. I'll pop your goddamn knee off. The girl.
She's alive. She's David's newest pet.
Where?
In the town. In the town.
Now you're gonna mark it on the map. And it better be the same exact spot your buddy points to. Mark it.
It's right there. You can verify it. Go ask him. Go on. I tell you, I ain't lying. I ain't.
Fuck you, man. He told you what you wanted. I ain't telling you shit.
That's all right. I believe him.
No, wait!
We then go back to Ellie where David and David's friend are about to butcher her, but she manages to distract them by telling them that she's infected, showing them the bite on her arm. It works, and she uses the opening to kill David's friend and escape. The next gameplay section has the player sneaking through David's town during a blizzard with basically no weapons other than a knife. You can kill enemies to try and take the guns and ammo off their bodies, but stealth is clearly the best course of action here. Because of the harsh weather, your visibility is lowered. To compensate for this, the game lowers the distance that the guards can see you, which is only fair. Add the fact that you're unarmed and very heavily outnumbered with the low visibility, and the fact that you have no idea where you're going, it really pushes this feeling that you're in danger. While playing through this section, I felt lost, vulnerable, and totally unprepared for whatever lie ahead, as if I was about to walk into an ambush or something, which is exactly how something like this should feel. After sneaking through town and avoiding the hunters, we end up in a large restaurant. While attempting to cut through and leave, Ellie is ambushed by David again. He'll take your gun away if you have one. Any equipment you had on you from before he ambushes you will be gone, save for Ellie's pocket knife and any medkits you picked up. You then have a standoff with David, which is the closest thing to a boss fight that you'll find in The Last of Us. The player needs to sneak up on David from behind and stab him 3 times. Each time you stab him, he'll change into a different phase. In the first phase, he has a gun. In the second phase, the gun runs out of ammo and he resorts to using a machete. In the third phase, David actually resorts to crouching and sneaking around himself just like Ellie, making himself harder to detect and thus harder to sneak up on. There are broken plates scattered all over the floor that, when walked on, make noise. Since players need to go through the restaurant first, they have time to get familiar with their surroundings somewhat, and to learn that stepping on the broken plates makes a noise. After sneaking up on and stabbing David a 3rd time, he and Ellie are both knocked unconscious. We cut back to Joel, who just arrived at the entrance to the town. He finds his way in, and while cutting through one of the buildings, finds Ellie's backpack and an old walk-in freezer that's filled with bodies. After leaving the building, he sees the restaurant where Ellie is at, which is on fire. We cut back to Ellie, and she wakes up and starts crawling towards David's machete that he dropped. The player is in control of Ellie as she's crawling to enhance that feeling of desperation. David gets up again and kicks her around a little before she grabs the machete and violently kills him just as Joel shows up.
Stop! Stop!
Fucking
fucking touch me!
It's okay. It's me. It's me. It's me. Look. It's me.
He tried to...
Oh, baby girl. It's okay. It's okay.
Joel.
It's okay.
This is the end of the chapter, so I suppose I should talk about David's role in the story. Bill's purpose in the story was to give Joel an opportunity to reflect on himself and ask himself if the road he was on was really the one he wanted to go down. Sam and Henry were meant to be a warning to Joel and Ellie that they need to act like partners if they want to survive. Because Joel is out of action for most of Chapter 9, David's purpose is primarily just for the character development of Ellie. We never learn what Joel was up to over the course of those 20 years after the prologue, but throughout the course of the game it's hinted plenty of times that Joel did some really messed up stuff. And it's easy to believe because we even see him do some messed up stuff. He participated in the torture and murder of at least 3 people as we've seen so far. During the start of Chapter 5 in Pittsburgh, after Joel and Ellie get ambushed by the hunters and crash their truck, Ellie asks Joel how he knew about the ambush. He says that he's been on both sides before. Ellie then asks him if he killed a lot of innocent people, and Joel doesn't answer, which she takes as a yes. Back in Chapter 7 at the dam during the argument where Joel was trying to convince Tommy to take Ellie to the Fireflies, he says this after he refuses.
This is how you gonna repay me, huh?
Repay you?
For all those goddamn years I took care of us.
Took care? That's what you call it? I got nothing but nightmares from those years.
You survived because of me.
It wasn't worth it.
I bring you the cure from mankind, and you want to play the pissy little brother.
Joel, over the course of the game so far, has been slowly becoming more and more comfortable around Ellie, which makes sense because the main purpose of this game's story is to have us bond with Ellie from the perspective of Joel. So we keep thinking about what kind of influence Ellie is having on Joel instead of the other way around. Ellie is still a kid, and kids can be really impressionable, and Joel may not exactly be the best influence on her. We see Joel torture 2 guys to figure out Ellie's whereabouts before brutally killing them. He didn't need to kill them, but he did anyway, because he wanted to. The same was true with Robert back in Boston. We may sympathize with Joel, but he's clearly not a good person. When David first approached Ellie in the woods, I honestly thought he had good intentions, but later I found out that he's one of the most morally reprehensible characters in the game. Ellie, however, was skeptical of him from the start. She becomes a little more trusting of him after a while, but when he reveals that it was his people that her and Joel killed at the university, she realizes that her first reaction to not trust him was correct. Even more so after she was captured and she learned why he was being so nice to her. Ellie has killed people before, and when she did, she behaved appropriately. After shooting the guy in the head in the hotel in Pittsburgh, she said that she felt sick. And after covering Joel with a rifle after leaving the hotel, she seemed a bit shell-shocked. So she has killed before, and she has had to go through the stages of coping with that. But killing David was different. Joel killed those 2 hunters from before for the same reason that Ellie killed David. She didn't just kill David because she had to. She also did it because she wanted to. But since she's a kid and has a totally different personality than Joel, she reacted to this in a totally different way, likely feeling awful and disgusted with herself for what she did, while simultaneously feeling angry and scared that she was almost killed or worse. A feeling that was likely enhanced by the fact that this is the most brutal and violent way we ever see her kill someone. Yes, Ellie doing these things and learning all these skills is necessary for her to become a better survivor, but survival during the apocalypse has a price. The screen cuts to black again and we have our final major time skip to spring at the start of Chapter 10. This time skip is by far the most jarring one. In one scene, Ellie is almost brutally murdered and eaten by someone, and she manages to save herself by violently killing the guy. And in the next scene, she's daydreaming while her and Joel are walking down a calm highway in the sunny, warm spring. By this time, Joel and Ellie have made it to Salt Lake City, Utah, and are nearby the hospital where the Firefly lab is supposed to be. At this point, Joel has fully warmed up to Ellie and seems much more comfortable around her. He even talks to her about teaching her how to play the guitar once they're done with what they're doing. They walk down the highway, go into another abandoned quarantine zone, and cut through an old bus terminal. This is another quiet moment like the ones before, but this one is especially quiet because Ellie seems much more quiet and distant than usual. There is this one exception where Ellie engages in a conversation with Joel about a dream she had.
I dreamt about flying the other night.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Go on, tell me about it.
So, I'm on this big plane full of people, and everyone is screaming and yelling because the plane's going down. So I walk to the cockpit, open the door, but there's no pilot. I try to use the controls, but I obviously have no clue how to fly a plane. And right before we crash, I wake up. I've never been on a plane. Isn't that weird?
Well, you know, dreams are weird.
I'm no expert in dream logic, but this seems to be an analogy for how distant she feels from the person she was before this whole journey started, with the plane being an analogy for her own life. 1 minute, everything's fine with the plane flying in the air smoothly, then the pilots disappear and the plane starts nosediving, and she has to fly it herself despite having no clue what she's doing. That's my take on it anyway. She's not really paying much attention to Joel as he talks to her. She even ignores one of the standard gameplay sequences that you've done a bunch of times where she gets boosted up to a ledge.
Here we go. Ellie? Ellie?
What?
The ladder. Come on.
Right.
After she gets up there, she tries to pass down the ladder, but she drops it after seeing something that surprises her. When you make it up there, she's clearly excited by something, which turns out to be this.
You see this?
Shh, don't scare it.
I won't.
What are you doing?
It's all right. Come here. Hurry up. Come on.
Hey there. So fucking cool. Oh, where's it off to? Here, come on, let's go.
Slow down, kiddo.
Come on.
This is the most bombastic calm moment in The Last of Us, and it's also the last one before the epilogue. The player can choose to enjoy the view for as long as they want, and they can leave at any time they want. On top of the main plot between Joel and Ellie, there's also a sub-theme in The Last of Us of man versus nature. There's as many areas in the game with infected enemies as there are areas with human enemies, and whenever the players aren't fighting or avoiding humans or infected, they're walking around enjoying the scenery. Most of the calmer sections usually have a ton of plant life, and you encounter multiple animals as well. As one example, look back at the Boston quarantine zone. You start out in this gray, gloomy street populated by other people, and when you leave the relative safety of the zone, there's plant life and dense vegetation everywhere. The angle that The Last of Us takes the post-apocalyptic genre is an interesting one. Most games in that genre portray a bleak and gloomy place where the human race tries to survive in a world plagued by something awful that they brought upon themselves. Sometimes it's a zombie virus that was created in a lab somewhere, and sometimes it's nuclear war. In The Last of Us, the thing that caused humanity's undoing wasn't their fault. It was ultimately nature that caused all of this. A parasitic fungus that was previously thought to be harmless mutated and can now affect humans. It's as simple as that. And while the infected enemies are not human beings anymore, they were at one point. Nature just turned them into monsters. The environments in most post-apocalyptic games look gloomy and awful and are supposed to make you think, wow, I'm glad I'll never end up in a place like this in real life. Whereas the environments in The Last of Us look post-apocalyptic, but sometimes they can look almost like paradise with all the animals and plant life. This was unique for its time, because when we think post-apocalyptic, we think of a world that's unrecognizable or uninhabitable to most forms of life as we know it. The word paradise usually doesn't jump to mind when thinking of the genre of post-apocalyptia. This part is a little tagged on, but if you want to see a video that goes more in depth on post-apocalyptic themes and aesthetics, I recommend this video by EuroThug4000. I'll leave a link to it somewhere down below so you can watch it after you're finished watching this video. This portrayal of a beautiful post-apocalyptic world where the earth and nature prospers with the human race gone or too busy to stay alive to maintain all the buildings or pump ozone-killing gases into the air would be so influential that some future games would just straight up copy this style. The way that the violence is portrayed in this game emphasizes this even further. You can burn people alive, blow their heads off with a shotgun, blow their limbs off with a nail bomb, and kill them in a variety of other ways with the makeshift weapons made from garbage you find lying around all over the place. The violence and death scenes when your character dies are all very brutal. This is meant to push the players into this pessimistic mindset that maybe the world of The Last of Us would be better off if the human race would just quietly slip into extinction. So that way, the moments of bonding with Ellie can stick out more. Because the time you spend bonding with the characters is usually the only time spent with other humans that's pleasant. Every other human encounter in the game is either tense or scary because they're an active threat. The only peaceful times are when there are no people and all that's around you is nature. So when you're listening to Ellie read off dumb little puns from a pun book or stare at the wildlife, it's a reminder that the human race can be ugly, but it can be beautiful at times too, just like nature. When you're about to leave the roof, Joel tells Ellie that she doesn't have to do this if she doesn't want to, and they can just turn around and go back to Tommy's place. Ellie says no, she wants to finish this because she doesn't want everything that she's been through to be for nothing. But after they're done, they can go anywhere Joel wants. When Joel started this journey, it was just a job. Then when Tess dies, it was to fulfill her dying wish. But at some point along the way, finding the Fireflies just became an excuse for him to be with Ellie. When Ellie started this journey, it was because she wanted to see if she could help find a cure for the cordyceps plague, an endeavor that Joel clearly doesn't have much interest in. Also, Ellie clearly just wanted to see the world outside the Boston quarantine zone, something that's encapsulated by this moment when they were looking at the giraffe herd.
So, is this everything you were hoping for?
It's got its ups and downs, but you can't deny the view, though.
With their end destination so close, this brings their journey full circle from when he last asked her the same question back in Boston.
So is that everything you hoped for?
Jury's still out. But man, you can't deny that view.
Ellie didn't want to stay stuck in the Boston quarantine zone her whole life. She wanted to go outside and experience the world herself. And she did. She walked across the entire country, something most people will never be able to do or even attempt because of the way the world is now. Now they're nearly at their destination, so the journey's about over, but at some point the destination became ancillary, and when they were getting close to it, Ellie started to realize this. That's why she's been especially quiet for the past while. She should be feeling happy and excited that it's almost over, but the feeling is a bittersweet one instead. She has doubts about going, but ultimately decides to finish this. They leave the bus terminal and go outside to a neighboring bus stop where Joel talks a little about his past, and Sarah.
This place takes me back.
How so?
It was right after everything went down. I ended up in a triage just like this. And everywhere you looked, you just saw families torn apart. The whole damn world seemed to have turned upside down in a blink.
Is that after you lost Sarah?
Yes, it was.
I can't imagine losing someone you love like that. Losing everything that you know. I'm sorry, Joel.
That's okay, Ellie.
That's when Ellie tells Joel that she took the photo of him and Sarah from Tommy's bag back at the dam. She's had it on her the whole time. This would likely be a surprise to most players, but I like how you can figure out that she stole the picture before this. Because when you play as Ellie in the Winter chapter and you look in her inventory, you can see that she has the picture, as well as Sam's robot, and a note from her mom, among other things. She gives the picture to Joel, and there's another button prompt like before, but this time he accepts the picture.
Well, no matter how hard you try, I guess you can't escape your past. Thank you.
The fact that Joel accepts the picture this time shows that he's grown as a character too. There's no option to say no because, again, we're not playing as ourselves, we're playing as Joel. This is meant to emphasize the fact that Joel's character growth had nothing to do with us. We were just along for the ride. After leaving the bus station, they cut through an old highway tunnel that's completely filled with infected. In fact, this tunnel has more infected than any other one spot in the game, including 3 bloaters. It's also the last place in the game where the player needs to face off infected enemies. Well, technically the last place is this poorly set up clicker jump scare at the end of the tunnel.
Look out!
They make it to another tunnel, but this one's flooded, and is turned into a full-blown river with a pretty strong current. They try to get across by hopping along some cars, but that doesn't go well.
Whoa! Ellie, move!
Ellie tries to help him, but ends up falling into the water, which is especially bad because she can't swim. Joel gets out of the bus and sees that she's been knocked unconscious. You swim over to her, grab her, and swim to the surface. When Joel gets out of the water, he sees that Ellie isn't breathing, so he starts giving her CPR. Then 2 fireflies show up and knock him out, ending Chapter 10. He wakes up later in a hospital bed at the start of Chapter 11, with Marlene sitting across from him.
Welcome to the Fireflies. Sorry about that. They didn't know who you were.
And Ellie?
She's all right. They brought her back.
Marlene tells Joel that the cordyceps fungus inside Ellie has mutated, which is why she's immune. And after surgically removing it, they'll be able to reverse engineer a vaccine. But that doesn't really make sense because the cordyceps is a fungus, not a virus, and you can't make a vaccine for a fungus. That's not how vaccines or fungus work. But whatever, you know, pseudoscience for the sake of video game plot. Marlene tells Joel that the surgery to remove the growth on Ellie's brain would kill her. Joel protests them going through with the surgery, and Marlene insists that she doesn't have a choice.
Find someone else.
There is no one else.
Listen, you were gonna show me where...
Stop. I get it. But whatever it is you think you're going through right now is nothing to what I have been through. I knew her since she was born. I promised her mother I would look after her.
Then why are you letting this happen?
Because this isn't about me, or even her. There is no other choice here.
Telling yourself that bullshit.
Joel has spent his entire life hearing people say that they need to sacrifice for the greater good. The soldier who shot Sarah was following orders, likely believing what he was doing was for the greater good. Joel lived in a military-controlled compound filled with soldiers who oppressed and terrorized the residents for the greater good. Tess insisted that Joel get Ellie to the Fireflies, and then sacrificed herself for the greater good. Tommy joined up with the Fireflies against Joel's wishes for the greater good. Every hard or morally questionable choice in this game has been done in the name of some nebulous greater good.
What happened here? Your fellow hunters do this?
Cute. And no, my money's on the military.
Why would they mow down all these people?
You can't let everyone in.
So they killed him?
And dead people don't get infected. You sacrifice the few to save the many.
It's kind of shitty.
Yeah.
If you want to hear more about how The Last of Us tackles the philosophy of utilitarianism, which is basically the philosophy of sacrificing for the greater good, I recommend this video by SolePorpoise. The link is down below somewhere, probably somewhere next to the Euro Thug 4000 video. I recommend watching both of them. We later learned through a diary entry and 2 recordings that Marlene was close friends with Ellie's mother, Anna. Marlene promised Anna that she would look after Ellie before she died. Marlene even got into a shouting match with the lead surgeon, insisting that he needed to find a way to keep Ellie alive somehow. But she ultimately caved in and gave them the go-ahead to do the surgery. Marlene tells one of the Fireflies to march Joel out of the hospital at gunpoint. He walks down the hallway for a bit, but then Joel takes his gun away. He then tortures the guy to figure out where Ellie is, grabs his backpack, and executes him. You then need to get past the Fireflies, either by sneaking or fighting your way through the wing of the hospital. You can shoot your way through because the previous statement about the game getting easier as it goes on still holds true. But this level is clearly designed in a way that it's both best and expected by the developers for players to sneak through. For a few reasons. First of all, the Fireflies are some of the toughest human enemies in the game. They have full body armor and assault rifles that fire in full auto. Secondly, the way the area is laid out makes it so that there's a path the players can sneak through. Most of the guards will be patrolling key hallways with flashlights, so you need to stay out of their line of sight and avoid them shining their light on you by ducking in and out of rooms and behind furniture. Third, you're going to want to save up your ammo and health kits, because the next area with Fireflies on the top floor is extremely hard to sneak through. The devs probably made it this way because it's the last area with enemies in the main game that players have to deal with, so there's no need to worry if you use up all your ammo and supplies fighting through these guys. When you make it to the surgery room, the game puts the player in another situation where they have control, but their actions are limited artificially. There are 2 nurses and the head surgeon. The doctor picks up a scalpel and threatens Joel not to come any closer. Killing the 2 nurses is optional, but you need to kill the head surgeon to advance the game. You can either shoot him, or walk over to him and press square, which will make Joel take the scalpel from his hand and stab him in the neck. He doesn't put up much of a fight when you do this either. At no point will he try to attack Joel no matter what you do or how close you get. You need to kill him to advance. The reason the game gives the player limited control here is the same reason as the 2 scenes involving the photo of Joel and Sarah from before. The game is reminding the players that they're playing as Joel, and anything the game lets the player do is something Joel would do. And as we've seen throughout the course of this game, when someone stands in the way of what Joel wants, his first instinct is to kill them, whether they pose a threat or not. Joel then picks up Ellie off the surgery table and runs through the hospital carrying her while the Fireflies chase after him, mirroring the prologue when he was running through the streets from infected while carrying Sarah, thus bringing Joel's character arc in the story full circle. When we first get to play as Joel, he's a father protecting his daughter, and the last time we get to play as him, he's back into that same role again. This is another fun little Easter egg. Midway through the escape sequence, you might be able to spot a seeing eye chart on the wall. If you read the chart, this is what it spells out. He runs into an elevator and goes down to the parking garage to escape the hospital. But Marlene is already there waiting for him. She tries to reason with Joel, telling him that this is what Ellie would have wanted. She puts her gun down and tells him he can still do the right thing. We then fast forward to Joel in a car driving down a road. At first it's unclear if he left Ellie or not, but we hear moaning, and sure enough, Ellie's in the back seat and is just now waking up. She asks Joel what happened. He tells her that they found the Fireflies, and it turns out that there's dozens of people who are immune just like her, and they didn't do them any good, and that they stopped looking for a cure. He tells her that he's taking them back to Tommy's, and that he's sorry. Of course, that's not what really happened. We flash back and see that Joel shot Marlene and put Ellie in the back of the car. Marlene asks Joel to at least let her live, but Joel says no, assuming that if he does, she'll just come after them later. Jump forward to the epilogue in Chapter 12. Joel and Ellie have made it most of the way to Tommy's, but their car broke down and they need to go the rest of the way on foot with a brisk walk through the woods. This is where we'll get to play as Ellie again. The switch to Ellie here has a purpose. While walking through the woods, you listen to Joel reminisce about old times and about Sarah, like he did at the start of Chapter 10. But back then, we were listening to him reminisce from his perspective, so players may not have thought much of it. But hearing him reminisce and talk about Sarah like this from Ellie's perspective actually makes him seem kind of pathetic. The reason that it's harder to see when playing as Joel is because Joel is kind of a fucking murder machine. In fact, he's probably the most morally reprehensible character in the whole game. We see him torture and kill a ton of people, both in cutscenes and in gameplay sections where the player is required to clear out the enemies before they can advance. But other than that, you also have the sections in the game where you have the option to sneak around or kill all the enemies. It's actually possible to kill almost every human enemy in the game, which amounts to a lot of people, possibly nearly 100. You don't need to kill everyone, but you can. And once again, it's worth repeating that you're playing as Joel, so anything you can do is something Joel would do. That's not even taking into account what he may have been up to during the 20 years between the first and second chapters. The only other character that's anywhere near as bad as Joel is David, but we never actually see David kill anyone. In fact, he goes through painstaking efforts to capture Ellie alive. Yes, he had ulterior motives, and he's clearly a different type of evil. He's a pedophile and a cannibal, but most people consider murder to be the ultimate evil. And yes, him and his group have clearly killed a lot of people, but they did that as a group. David likely didn't do all the killing by himself. And even if we give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he's killed more people than anyone else in his group, keep in mind he died after losing a fight to a 14-year-old girl. I don't see a guy who loses a fight to a little girl with a pocket knife killing as many people that Joel can or does over the course of the game. Joel is kind of a monster, and I imagine people will have mixed feelings about what Joel did back in the hospital. Even if you don't agree that him saving Ellie, thus dooming humanity, and killing both the head surgeon and Marlene is justified, it's still important to the story that the players still at least sympathize with him, and at least be able to see where he's coming from. In Chapter 10, we just saw Joel opening up to Ellie and reminiscing now that he trusts her more. But in the epilogue, seeing him do this from Ellie's perspective drives home that the reason that he did what he did is because he's just a bitter, sad, and lonely old man.
I don't think I ever told you, but Sarah and I used to take hikes like this. I think the two of you would have been good friends. I think you really would have liked her. I know she'd have liked you.
I bet I would have.
After they make it to a ridge overlooking Tommy's town, the end cutscene plays. This is one of the most memorable moments in the game. On the surface, the ending seems quite simple, but there's so much context behind it that you could only get from playing the game fully. Ellie tells Joel that the day she was bitten, she was with a friend named Riley. And Riley told her, and I quote, "They should be all poetic and lose their minds together." Now Ellie is still waiting for her turn. Joel tells her that none of that is on her and that you need to keep looking for a reason to keep surviving. Ellie says, "Swear to me everything you said about the Fireflies is true." Joel says, "I swear." Ellie responds, "Okay." Cut to black and the credits roll. There are two reasons that this ending is so memorable. The first thing is that there was a lot in this conversation that was implied, even though there's very few words spoken between the two of them, which is likely a testament to how close the two of them are at this point.
Back in Boston? Back when I was bitten? I wasn't alone. My best friend was there. And she got bit too. We didn't know what to do. So, she says, let's just wait it out. You know, we can be all poetic and just lose our minds together. I'm still waiting for my turn.
Ellie.
Her name was Riley, and she was the first to die. And then it was Tess. And then Sam.
Here we see that another one of the reasons Ellie wanted to help the Fireflies find a cure is because she's suffering from survivor's guilt. She feels bad that other people, including people she cares about, have died over a plague that doesn't affect her.
None of that is on you.
You don't understand.
I struggled for a long time with surviving. And you... No matter what, you keep finding something to fight for.
Joel's hand brushes his watch when he says that, showing that he's thinking about Sarah. But more than anything, it shows that he still hasn't gotten over his daughter's death. He may have learned to love again, but just like Ellie, he still can't let go of the past.
I want to hear right now.
Swear to me. Swear to me that everything that you said about the Fireflies is true.
She says this even though she knows that Joel lied to her. There's no deep way that the game conveys this. It's just obvious because the lie that Joel told her in the car was a terrible one.
What the hell am I wearing?
Just take it easy. Drugs are still wearing off.
What happened?
We found the Fireflies. Turns out there's a whole lot more like you, Ellie. People that are immune. There's dozens, actually. Ain't done them a damn bit of good, neither. They've stopped looking for a cure. I'm taking us home. I'm sorry.
I don't know about anyone else, but I would have so many follow-up questions after hearing that. Where did you get the car? Why am I in a hospital gown? Also, what drugs? Who drugged me, and why? Why didn't you wait for me to wake up before we left? Ellie's smart enough to put two and two together and figure out what was going to happen. So when Ellie asks this, it's more of her asking Joel to do a better job of convincing her that he's telling the truth.
I swear.
The way Joel is saying that looks and sounds just like when he was in the ranch house back in the Dam chapter.
You're right. You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad.
The reason that he's saying it like this is because he's trying really hard to convince both Ellie and himself that what he's saying is true. And you can tell the way Ellie says okay back to him that she's trying to do the same thing.
Okay.
The second reason I believe that this ending is so memorable to so many people is because it shows that there's still character development to be had between the two. Joel and Ellie may have formed a relationship over the course of the story, but the ending shows that they still have problems. And instead of resolving those issues and wrapping both of their stories up in a neat little bow, the game just ends before that happens. The fact that the game starts twice in the beginning, once in the prologue and once again after the time skip in Chapter 2, makes it so that The Last of Us ditches the once upon a time trope of storytelling. And this ending outright ditches the "and they all lived happily ever after" style of ending. This makes Joel and Ellie feel like two people who went on a journey that we got the privilege of witnessing and less like characters to facilitate the story. Because in real life, people don't stop growing, and this ending shows that they both clearly still have room to grow. We may be done following the pair of them on this adventure, but they will go on to have more and grow and change as people without us. But we're not done yet, because we still have the DLC. Left Behind was part of a free DLC pack for The Last of Us that launched on February 14th, 2014. The DLC has us playing as Ellie again while jumping between two different timelines. One timeline shows what Ellie was doing back in Boston leading up to the events of her getting bitten, and the other timeline takes place between chapters 8 and 9 when Joel was injured. The whole thing can be completed in about 2 to 3 hours. As far as gameplay goes, it doesn't offer that much of anything different that we don't get to experience in the main game. The timeline with Ellie from before she was bitten is meant to act as the calm moments of character development, sort of like the calm moments in the main game, whereas the timeline with Ellie right after Chapter 8 is focused on combat with more humans and infected. One thing this expansion does that the main game doesn't is let the hunters and infected fight each other, something that was absent with all the human and infected enemies always being isolated from each other in different areas. Story-wise, it's mostly meant to act as character development for Ellie, giving context to the events leading up to her getting bit, and showing how she saved Joel's life after he got injured at the university in Colorado. It starts back in the Boston quarantine zone at the military boarding school that Ellie attended. Then after the opening cutscene ends, it flashes forward to Ellie in the future. Left Behind goes back and forth from the timeline in Boston and the timeline in Colorado several times. Jumping back and forth in this video would just make it too confusing to follow. So for simplicity's sake, I'll just explain both timelines one at a time, starting with the one in Colorado because it's the easiest one to talk about. It shows Ellie in an old fast food joint at an abandoned mall, desperately looking for supplies to treat Joel's injury. She doesn't find any medical supplies, but she does find some tape. She uses that and one of her old shirts to stop the bleeding. Then she goes to look through the mall for supplies to help him. She takes a lock that she seems to conjure out of nowhere and locks the shutter before leaving. You go through the mall until you find a pharmacy. The shelves are all empty. However, Ellie sees a medical kit through a window into the back room. But of course, the door's locked. There's a note from the owner saying that he's in the doll shop next door with a code to open up the shutter. You go over there, and when you get into the shop, it's filled with spores. The spores in the air combined with the fact that there's dolls and pink everywhere makes the atmosphere super creepy. And it's actually kind of disappointing that there aren't any infected in here. Ellie doesn't have any ammo or equipment at the start of this, and making players sneak through this area while needing to avoid a clicker or two would have been really scary. But the first clicker you encounter is outside the store when you leave instead. She finds the keys and goes back to the pharmacy. She gets into the back room and opens up the medical kit, but unfortunately it's empty. Then she notices a crashed military helicopter and decides to go there to look for supplies. She cuts through an old hair salon and finds the body of one of the helicopter crew members. There's another small side story involving the helicopter crew that's told through notes and tape recordings. Apparently they were a crew of military medics who crashed after a patient that they had with them had turned and killed the pilot. They didn't know that he was infected when they brought him on board, and they didn't see any bites, so he probably inhaled spores. One of the other crew members was bitten before killing the infected, and after they crashed, the captain of the team executed the infected crew member. Apparently it's protocol that if someone gets infected, you terminate them immediately no matter who they are. The two surviving crew members waited for rescue, but it never came. The two of them eventually got attacked and one of them got bitten. The soldier that got bitten tried to shoot himself, but the captain knocked him out and tried to save him by amputating his arm. Apparently she felt bad for killing the last soldier who got bitten and didn't want to do it again. It looks like it worked and the crew member didn't turn. However, the amputation did cause a fever, which caused the crew member to become extremely paranoid. When they were both eating, the soldier with one arm finished his food first and forgot. So when he saw the captain eating her food, he punched her in the face and accused her of stealing his. She almost left him there, but then had a change of heart. Sometime after that, the captain and the injured soldier were just talking, and an infected came up to them. The captain went for her gun, but the injured soldier didn't notice the infected and thought that she was about to shoot him, so he shot her. The infected attacked him, he struggled with it, and ran away. However, the struggle reopened the stitches on his arm, and he bled to death in an air duct. Ellie tries to get to the crashed helicopter, but the only way up is blocked off by a locked gate. The gate has an electronic lock on it, so you'll need to follow the electronic cable and try to see if you can restore power to the door. There's a generator, but it needs fuel, so you take a jerry can and go to look for fuel in one of the vehicles in the garage area. Stalkers show up, marking their third and final appearance in the game. After fighting them off, you go back to looking for fuel. After checking some vehicles, you find some and Ellie siphons it out. You go back to the generator, put the gas in, and fire it up. The power kicks back on, but the water becomes electrified, which means you can't go back the way you came. You need to cross the room using the rafters, hopping over the trucks, and doing the first real puzzle in The Last of Us. Get back to the gate, open it, and get through while also being careful about the clickers. Get over to the helicopter and jump in. Ellie looks around inside the helicopter and finds a full medical kit.
Please be in here. I'm not letting you go. I'm not letting you go.
After she jumps down, you then need to go back to Joel, but it turns out the hunters from the university followed you and are searching the mall. You make your way back to Joel, dealing with hunters and infected as you go. When you make it back, you see that the hunters are there already. They haven't gotten to Joel yet, but they can hear the horse inside the store. One of the guys starts beating on the lock, trying to get the shutter door open. You need to kill them all before you can get in. After doing that, you go down to the shutter and try to get in, but more hunters show up and eventually the shooting attracts the infected. After finally killing everything, Ellie goes back to Joel and stitches him up. They later leave the area with Ellie dragging Joel behind her on the horse, and that is the end of the first timeline. The second one happens back in Boston, where Ellie's friend Riley shows up. The same Riley that Ellie was talking about during the ending of the main game. Apparently, Ellie hasn't seen Riley for almost a year because she was off joining the Fireflies. So to make it up to Ellie for disappearing without telling her where she was going and being gone for so long, Riley wants Ellie to sneak out with her and go somewhere. Ellie doesn't think that it's a good idea and doesn't want to get in trouble, but Riley insists, saying what's the worst that could happen? They both sneak out and go to an abandoned mall that's been completely quarantined off by the military. Yep, this part of the story also takes place in an abandoned mall. And for a very good reason, which we'll get into later. Along the way, Ellie and Riley talk some more. They do a little catching up, and Ellie asks Riley how she got into the Fireflies. She says that she followed one of them to their hideout, but it was a trap, and the Fireflies ambushed her, captured her, and took her to Marlene. At first, she was scared that they were going to kill her, but she convinced them to let her join them instead. Ellie asks if she could join the Fireflies too, but apparently Riley already asked Marlene that same question, and she gave her a very strong no. Since Ellie's mother asked Marlene to take care of her before she died, she thought that letting her join the Fireflies would be too dangerous. They go to the mall and look around. Apparently a friendly acquaintance of Ellie and Riley's used to live there. A guy named Winston who had a heart attack and died while riding his horse through town, which is a nice callback to a moment in the main game.
Can I?
Yeah, of course. He likes when you pet his ears. You ever ride one?
I actually have.
When have you ridden a horse?
Winston, this soldier back in the zone. He gave me lessons.
You know, if you want, we can take him riding later.
That'd be awesome.
What happened to Princess?
I assumed after Winston died, they took her. Poor horse. She's probably out there terrified.
Man.
They've apparently been to this mall a bunch of times before, and when their usual route gets blocked, they cut through a Halloween store.
You dick! That's 2 times today!
The main point of the Boston timeline is to show Ellie and Riley just being kids. They play around in the Halloween store for a little while, and once they get bored of that, they go outside and start throwing bricks at car windows.
Yes! Rick fucking Master!
It turns out Riley's surprise for Ellie was that she found out that the military didn't cut power to the mall, they just flipped the circuit breaker. So they go find it, flip it, and restore power to the whole mall.
There's no way this is gonna work. What did I tell you?
Wait, so the whole mall is lit up?
Let's go find out.
After the power is restored, they go back to messing around in the mall, and one of the first things they do is go riding on an old carousel. Which, by the way, just as a side note, the mall has been abandoned for so long that that carousel should sound loud, squeaky, and rusty. It doesn't really affect the game at all, I'm just saying. Ellie reads out of one of her pun books.
I heard 2 peanuts walked into a park. One was assaulted.
Ah!
Good one. Good one.
They mess around with a photo booth. They get to ride on an escalator for the first time.
Whoa! Look at me!
Ellie pretends to play an arcade machine.
You nailed him with a wicked elbow, taking off like 15% of his health.
Yes!
He spins around and comes back with a shadow claw attack. What do I do? Hold back and block to counter. You throw up your elbows just as he executes his combo. You skid backwards but take no damage. The final block knocks him off his balance.
And they mess around with some water guns.
Destroyed you. I told ya.
It was pretty close.
What?
Yeah.
You are delusional.
Eventually, Riley tells Ellie that she's leaving the Boston quarantine zone tomorrow. The Fireflies want to station her in a different city, so Ellie and Riley likely won't see each other again for a long time, if ever again. Riley never outright says it, but it's pretty heavily implied that the reason that she wanted to come out there with Ellie was because she wanted to apologize for ditching her, and because she wanted them to spend one last day together. At first, Ellie's understandably not happy, and they have a fight, but eventually she tells Riley that she should just go. Ellie is trying to be supportive of Riley because she knows being a Firefly is what she wants, but she also doesn't want her to leave, which is why a little while later, Ellie straight up asks Riley not to go. Riley responds to this by taking off her Firefly pendant and throwing it away, clearly displaying Riley choosing Ellie over her dream of being a Firefly. Then it shows that Ellie and Riley's relationship is more than just friendship. The lesbian thing may have been a shock to some people, but to be honest, it was telegraphed pretty hard. The lead writer for The Last of Us, Neil Druckmann, confirmed that Ellie is a lesbian and not bisexual or confused. This was devastating for some people because this means Ellie will likely never have children. So whatever unique genealogical or biological traits she has that make her immune to the cordyceps likely won't be passed down to the next generation. Their moment is interrupted, however, because all of the noise they were making attracted the infected. They run through the mall trying to get away and almost make it out, but they both end up getting bitten.
Reach up, I got you. Hold on, give me your hand.
I think it's clear.
Ellie. Ellie, your arm.
No. No.
I like how this line at the end ties the ending of the DLC to the ending of the main game.
Let's just wait it out. You know, we can be all poetic and just lose our minds together.
She says, let's just wait it out. You know, we can be all poetic and just lose our minds together.
The DLC ends on a bit of a cliffhanger because we never learn what happened to Riley. We know she's dead now, but we never get to see how she dies. Did Ellie kill her after she turned? Did Riley change her mind about not taking the easy way out and shoot herself? Or did Ellie just leave her after she turned? And if so, is she still out there as a clicker handcuffed to a radiator somewhere or something? All the way back in Boston, after leaving the museum, Ellie and Tess were talking, and she questions Ellie about how she got bit. During their conversation, Ellie says that the first person that she went to for help after getting bitten was Marlene.
So Marlene thinks you're immune?
Well, that's what she believes.
Well, how were you bitten? I mean, you must have been somewhere you shouldn't to find an infected in the zone.
Yeah, I'd sneak out. I was in this military boarding school.
You'd sneak out?
You know, explore the city.
I was in the mall when I ran into infected.
That place is completely off limits. How the hell did you get in there?
I had my ways. Anyways, one of those, what you guys call runners, bit me, and that was that.
I see. Were you with Marlene when you were bitten?
No. I went to her for help afterwards.
Knowing her, I'm surprised she didn't shoot you.
She almost did. Hope she's all right.
I told you. She's gonna be fine.
So does that mean Marlene killed Riley? None of these questions are really ever answered. When the infected show up in the mall, they need to leave their backpacks behind. There's even a line of dialogue where Ellie brings this up as they're running away.
This way. Ellie!
What about our backpacks?
Fuck the backpacks!
But when we play as Ellie in the Colorado timeline, she has her backpack, and it is the same backpack. The same is true for the main game, and she even has Riley's Firefly pendant, which we see her throw away. So she must have gone back to that electronics store at some point to get them. And the fact that there's a line of dialogue that draws attention to this proves that this was intentional on the developer's part. Also, remember earlier when Ellie patched up Joel's injury with her old shirt? You can actually find that shirt hanging on a clothing rack inside the electronics store. So I guess when she came back through here, she also grabbed that shirt for some reason. We don't know exactly what happened to Riley, and odds are we're never going to know, because all that matters is that she's gone now, and it provides more context to Ellie's survivor's guilt. The fact that these two separate stories about Ellie are happening in abandoned malls is clearly no coincidence. The Boston timeline has Ellie messing around with Riley as a way to show how Ellie's growing up. In contrast, when it switches over to the Colorado timeline where she's trying to save Joel's life. Ashley Johnson did a pretty good job voicing Ellie, but I feel like she was at her best in the DLC. Left Behind came out about a year after the main game, so by then she probably had a much better feel for the character. You can tell she was having a lot of fun with it as well.
Ha 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 ha! The ruby slippers! What have you done with them?
Oh my, Toto! What will we do?
Oh man.
And although I really enjoyed Ellie as a character, I never really bonded with her the way the game clearly wanted me to, for whatever reason. Maybe it had something to do with the fact that the whole story of The Last of Us is actually pretty cliché, hitting a lot of the post-apocalyptic zombie tropes. The game starts right before the infection breaks out, the protagonist loses someone they're close to early on, it's revealed in the future that this loss turns the protagonist into a bit of an asshole, there's an immune character that you need to escort to location X so they can make a cure, one character gets infected and sacrifices themselves for the good of the group, another character lives in an isolated location all by themselves and goes a little stir-crazy, the innocent character that you've been killing people to protect loses some of her innocence when she's forced to kill herself. One of the characters gets bitten and doesn't tell the others. A character is forced to kill someone he cares about after he gets infected and commits guilt-ridden suicide. The protagonist tries to pretend that he doesn't care about the person that he's been protecting this whole time, and then he reveals that he does. The protagonist gets injured, and the person that they've been protecting this whole time has to become the protector for a little while. There's a group of people that seem convincingly nice at first, but then they're revealed to be cannibals. After you make it to your destination, it's revealed that the immune person you've been protecting this whole time needs to die so they can get the cure to save humanity. Zombies have been done, you get the idea. In fact, this whole game seems to be wanting for originality. It can be hard to bond with a character when you've seen the situation that they've been in 1,000 times before, just played out slightly differently. And maybe this, combined with Ellie's AI acting stupid during the gameplay sections, is what kept me from bonding with her. After all, how can I be expected to bond with a character that's a constant companion if their AI is constantly getting in the way of the immersion? The only times I felt as though this worked during gameplay were during the scripted comm sections. I also couldn't really bond with Joel either. The writing makes it pretty easy to sympathize with him, but sympathy only gets you so far. Let me explain what I mean. During the course of this whole game, we spend multiple hours with both Joel and Ellie. Over the course of those hours, we learn a lot of stuff about Ellie in particular. We learn about her personality traits, her hobbies, her interests, her backstory, what she wishes she could do with her life, her vulnerabilities. We learn all sorts of stuff about her. She's actually a really well-written character, and not just by video game standards either. Now, what do we know about Joel? Well, he was alive before the apocalypse happened, and he did have a daughter, but she died. That loss turned him into a bit of a cold and distant person. He's good at surviving in the apocalypse, but he's also kind of a dick. He's a good shot. He likes sports and guitar. He's from Texas. You get the idea. But that might have been intentional on the writer's part, having us play as a cold and distant character, so that way when he opens up to Ellie, it feels like he's opening up to us. And if that was the goal, then it was kind of a swing and a miss. We only see him attempt to bond with Ellie a total of 6 times throughout the entire game. Every other time, I either felt sorry for him, or I felt off-put by his actions. 3 times in Chapter 8, 2 times in Chapter 10, and once in the epilogue. In Chapter 8, we hear Joel try to teach Ellie about sports.
Give the ball to the other team?
Right, it's called turnover.
And if you clear the 10 yards, then you're back at first down?
First down, that's right.
Man, it's confusing.
You just gotta play it a couple times. It all makes sense.
When Ellie asks him what he wanted to be when he was a kid, Joel says that he wanted to be a singer.
What about you? What do you want?
Well, when I was a kid, I used to want to be, a singer.
Shut up.
I'm serious.
Sing something.
No.
Come on, I won't laugh.
I don't think so.
Joel, please.
And then later he opens up a little bit more about his life before Sarah died. At the beginning of Chapter 10, we hear him talk about how he likes guitar, and around halfway through the chapter, he opens up more to Ellie about Sarah. The same is true for the epilogue, but all the times that Joel opens up about Sarah's death to Ellie doesn't count as us bonding with him, because we have a totally unique perspective on Sarah's death that Ellie doesn't, since we actually saw her die. The problem is, it's actually impossible for us to bond with Joel over Sarah's death in the same way that Ellie can. By the end, it's pretty obvious that Ellie and Joel did bond, but they bonded in a way that was totally different from the way that we bonded with them. Which is what I was saying before when I said that I felt like the seasonal time skips felt like cheating. As a character, he is clearly deeply flawed, and I get why some people would find that endearing. But keep in mind, just because someone's an endearing character doesn't mean that they're a good person. As an example, the Joker from the Batman series is an endearing character, but that doesn't mean that he's a good person. And yes, most of the time in the game, when Joel kills someone, he does it with purpose and not just for the sake of killing. But being able to understand the motivation behind someone's actions is not the same thing as thinking that their actions are justified. The reason that Joel is easy to like as a character, regardless of the fact that he's not a good person, is because he's clearly willing to go through great lengths to protect Ellie. I mean, he was a good man, and a father at one point, so surely there must be some redeeming qualities there buried somewhere under all the flaws. And I think that might actually be the reason why that Joel and Ellie work so well together. As a character, Ellie is pretty easy to like, and since she's a kid, she also acts as the comedic levity in this game. She has good, straightforward intentions, and her actions are well-meaning, whereas Joel as a character is the exact opposite. As a character, he's pretty hard to like, being stoically cold and distant. His actions are a lot more morally gray, and his intentions are a lot more self-centered. Getting to see these two diametrically opposed characters play off each other is probably what makes them such an interesting duo. While the story itself isn't very original, it's still very well told, with a solid script and good acting. The journey the characters go on feels fittingly long, and the visuals change up just enough chapter by chapter to keep everything feeling fresh. But admittingly, there's still better post-apocalyptic stories out there. There's also better shooting games, better stealth games, better survival horror games, and possibly better zombie games depending on what you're looking for. Most of what The Last of Us does is done just as well or even better in other games and media, but the individual parts that are here mostly work very well by themselves, even though it sometimes feels as though they don't all quite fit together. Regardless, they come together in the end to make a game with a satisfying experience. For some people, the experience that The Last of Us provides was enjoyable enough that it became their favorite game of all time, but determining whether or not you fall into that category of people is completely up to you. and that's The Last of Us. Playing through it sometimes felt like I was playing a masterpiece. The game has quite a few things to like about it. It has a well-told story and enjoyable characters. The game world looks fantastic and is flushed with detail. Enemy encounters can feel like an exciting and frantic struggle just to stay alive. The whole game was one entertaining gameplay sequence and story beat after another, but it was bogged down by too many problems that kept it from entering masterpiece territory for me. The problems with the AI, the occasional bug and glitch, the infected enemy design not matching up with their behavior, the repetitive ladder and pallet puzzles, the fact that the game gets less challenging as it goes on rather than more challenging, the cause for the journey the characters go on has a giant plot hole in it. The story itself is kinda cliche and therefore safe feeling. There's the occasional bit where the story gets in the way of the gameplay, like the financial plaza outside the hotel where enemies will endlessly respawn until the player gets caught, or the part with the invisible sniper with magical target-seeking bullets. Despite these problems, I still enjoy The Last of Us and can easily recommend it to someone who is a fan of action games or games with well-told stories. It is a pretty great game, even if I wasn't blown away by it like some others were, and I can see myself replaying it again in a few years after I've forgotten about it enough for it to feel fresh in my mind again. In the meantime, I guess we'll see if the sequel holds a candle to this game or not. Hey, you made it all the way to the end of the video, aren't you a trooper? This is my biggest video so far. 3 hours long, God. So far, the only video that I've made that was anywhere near this long was the Resident Evil 2 review and analysis video. That's one of the things that I regret about that video the most. The scripting, structuring was nowhere near as tight as it could have been. But, yeah. Whew. This was a long one. In my last video, I said I wanted to upload a video once every month, and here I am, 4 months later. Man, this took a long time to get done. But at least it's over, and now I can move on to other— oh, fuck, I gotta do a video on the second one, don't I? Oh. Fine, I'll do a video on the sequel, but after that, I am done with these analysis videos for a little while. There's other projects I want to do that will consist of shorter videos. Oh, speaking of my last video, Freedom Fighters is now available for purchase on GOG and Steam, so you don't have to pirate it anymore. I bought and played the GOG version. It runs so much better. They didn't add hotkeys like I was hoping, but they did add the weapon wheel from the console version, so there's that. It's better than nothing. Oh yeah, and the image that I'm using at the end of this video is of Kiki from Kiki's Delivery Service with a sniper rifle. I'm just showing this to y'all because it makes me smile. The Twitter handle for the artist is directly under the image. Let's see, is there anything else? Check out the Euro Thug and the SolePorpoise videos. They're probably down in the description somewhere. I'm gonna have to put some timestamps down there or something. This is a long video. Like, the only way I can expect someone to watch it reasonably is if I put timestamps. So yeah, I guess I'll get started on that, The Last of Us Part 2 analysis video, or I'll make something out of it, I don't know. I don't know if it'll be a video like this, and I hope to God it won't be as long as this, but we'll see. I haven't played it yet, but I just finished installing it on my PlayStation 4, so I guess we'll see. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Oh! If you like this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all in the next video.